In the stillness before dawn, when the frost lies quiet upon the ancient stones of Skyrim, there are whispers that stir within the wind. They are not of the present, nor even the near past, but of a time veiled in the hush of myth, long before the Empire rose, before the Thu'um schemed, before even the mortals of the North bore names that we now recall. This is the age when the voice of the sky was still known, not as echo, but as law. And in that age, among ice-choked peaks and firelit halls of stone, there walked a cult of mortals who bowed not to the gods of Aetherius, but to the fire-breathing shapes that carved the heavens. The dragons, the dragon cult, revered in secrecy, feared in daylight, etched in silent ruin. It is said by those few texts that survived flame and silence, that the cult began not as blasphemy, but as worship most devout. In the days of snow, as they were later called in fragmented scrolls, retrieved from the collapse of Folohost, dragons descended not as beasts, but as gods incarnate, the children of Akatosh, Brith made flesh. Their voices were the wind, their flight the arc of destiny. Men did not resist them, men did not question. They knelt, and the dragons chose from among them priests, mortals, who would carry their word, bend the world, and carve the names of gods into stone. To understand the cult, one must first let go of all things measured in common time. These were not priests, as we now understand. These were not temples in the ordinary sense. Their rituals were not adorned in colour or joy, but in ash, in silence, in blood. The dragon priests, crowned in masks of ebon and gold, ruled vast swaths of the north, with the weight of divine decree. Their words spoken in the Thu'um, the sacred voice, could crumble walls, still breath, or summon fire from nothing. They did not ask to be obeyed. They were obeyed, as the sky is acknowledged, or as death is endured. Who they were before they bore the masks has been swallowed by dust. No birth names survive, no lineage remains clear. In what remains of ancient carvings, unearthed beneath the veil of echoes, their forms are tall, elongated, almost statuesque, as if time itself stretched their image to match their dominion. The masks the carved of were not mere symbols, they were enchanted relics, forged by unknown art, binding their wearers to the dragon's will. Each held a different name, each a voice of power. Morake, Croesus, Otar, the names drift now like autumn leaves across old stone, half forgotten. In those first centuries, when man still feared the night as an unmade thing, the dragon cult shaped the rhythms of life and death. Offerings were made, not only of goods, but of blood. The highest form of worship was surrender, of land, of thought, of breath. Atop the great Nordic barrows, high on the spines of the world, rituals were carried out under aurora-lit skies. Fires were kept burning for days at a time, sustained not by wood alone, but by oil, bone, and faith. According to heretical sources gathered from the scorched fragments beneath Labyrinthian, the dragon priests were not merely governors, they were mortals in slow becoming. Prolonged by the will of their dragon patrons, they walked among mortals for centuries, their eyes untouched by age, their skin pale and tight, like wax stretched over time. They drank not wine but power, the breath of those who served, the awe of those who bowed. Slowly, inexorably, they became something neither man nor God. Some say that this transformation required sacrifice, that to ascend as a true priest one had to give something beyond the physical, a memory, a name, perhaps even the soul's freedom. What was taken was never named aloud, but the ruins, in murals lost to ivy and cold, figures are shown kneeling before dragonfire, shadows leaving their forms like departing spirits, eyes closed, mouths open, not screaming, silent, always silent. The cult grew vast, woven into every stone hold, every village wrapped in mountain snow. Children were offered to the temples to be raised in the ways of service, chosen as initiates, bore tattoos in the shape of dragon wings across their backs, marked with ash, and burned into skin with sacred oil. These marks were believed to tether their voices to the Thu'um, though few ever reached the clarity of power needed to speak it. The hierarchy was absolute. At the top, the priests, eternal and aloof. Beneath them, the acolytes, learned, disciplined, but mortal still. Beneath them, the bone wardens and fire keepers, who maintained the temples and shrines with grim reverence, and below all, the supplicants, the faithful, the multitudes who prayed for favor, offered their crops, or sent sons and daughters into the snow for judgment. This structure was not questioned. To question was to be burned, not always by fire. Sometimes it was a look, a word, a name spoken in a whisper that never reached another day. But something stirred. Power, when drawn too tightly, begins to crack. There are records, faint almost myth, at the first whispers of discontent. A huntsman in the northern wilds who returned to find his village emptied, taken for tribute. A scholar whose voice was broken for transcribing the Thu'um without sanction. A child who returned from the mountain changed, silent, and cold-eyed. These were small things, barely echoes. But echoes can grow, and so began the long shadow. The dragon cult, once revered without question, began to draw fear, not as awe, but as loathing. Their glory, eternal as it was declared to be, began to tremble. But that tremble had not yet become collapse. Not yet. Not in this chapter of the world. The ruins remain. In the deep places, beneath the snow, under barrows guarded by Draga, who remember the chant even in death, the symbols still glow faintly with old magic. The priests lie in slumber, waiting, sealed with masks, still bound to soul and purpose. And the dragons, well, the dragons, in those days, still flew. Their wings darkened the sun, and men looked up in worship. Not in fear. Not yet. Not yet. When the pale moons hung low and twin shadows fell upon the glacier-rimmed crags of Skyrim, there was a silence that lingered like breath held for centuries. In this silence, the temples of the dragon cult rose, not by mortal ambition, but by decree from the sky. Their foundations were laid with obsidian and snowstone, built into the bones of the mountains themselves, as if the earth had been commanded to shape itself into shrines. They were not places meant for comfort. They were built to endure, to intimidate, to echo the presence of gods made flesh. There was no joy in them, only worship and the long, cold weight of divine service. Brumhunar, Volthumer, Ragnvald, names now etched faintly upon forgotten maps and half-cracked tablets, were among the greatest of these sanctuaries. Each housed a dragon priest, enthroned not with ceremony, but by ancient rite, his soul entwined with a mask of power, and his voice bound to the Thu'um. The temples functioned not only as halls of reverence, but as instruments of dominion. From their high altars, the priests issued commands that carried beyond wind and weather, spoken into the world with the force of the voice. There are accounts, though obscured by contradiction, of how these temples were first opened. Some say they emerged from the stone fully formed, breathed into being by dragons whose wings carved air into architecture. Others claim they were raised by legions of the faithful, whose hands bled into mortar and whose bones now line the crypts below. What is certain is that no mortal touched the inner sanctum without permission. These were not temples of welcome, they were structures of absolute control, their doors sealed by words, their chambers guarded by enchantments, older than death. Within, the walls bore no art save for what was sacred, spiraling glyphs of the dragon language, etched so deep into the stone that even centuries of ice could not wear them smooth. These words were not ornamental, they were alive. They hummed in the presence of breath, waiting, listening. Those who entered without knowledge often found their minds unraveled, or their hearts stilled, as if the temple itself rejected their unworthiness. And always above the altar the visage of the mask stared from its resting place, eyeless, voiceless, yet full of power. To enter such a place was not a pilgrimage, but an offering of self. The dragon cult was not only a religion, it was a structure of order, rooted in a cosmology, where dragons stood not above men by might alone, but by metaphysical design. The dragons were not merely creatures of scale and flame, they were fragments of the time god's own will, splinters of Akatosh scattered across Nirn, each carrying a shard of primordial authority. To serve them was to serve time itself. To disobey was not merely rebellion, it was blasphemy against the foundation of the world. Thus the dragon priests saw themselves not as tyrants, but as keepers of the sacred pattern. They believed that man, in his raw state, was lost, chaotic, unshaped. The voice, the Thu'um, was the means by which chaos could be disciplined. The cult, therefore, held a dual role: to praise the dragons, and to enforce the will of time upon the realm of men. This was not governance through law, it was governance through myth, enforced by fear and awe, reinforced by the constant presence of death as a ritual necessity. The rituals were complex and often veiled in secrecy. At the turning of seasons, acolytes gathered in circles, carved into mountain stone, chanting in the ancient tongue until the air itself shimmered. Offerings were brought, not of coin or harvest, but of vitality. Blood was spilled onto altars, shaped like dragon talons, collected into basins where runes glowed in silent reply. This was not cruelty for pleasure. It was, to them, a necessary exchange. Life surrendered for cosmic order. The acolytes were numerous. Raised from infancy, their names were erased, replaced with titles derived from the word walls that adorned the temple halls. They were taught to walk without sound, to speak only when commanded, and to dream in symbols. Their lives were short, often ending in service, but their deaths were honored with barrows, not as individuals, but as vessels that had borne purpose. Their bones were bound with linen etched in dragon script, entombed with the breath of incense and flame. Acolytes who showed exceptional strength of will or depth of silence were sometimes chosen for the deeper mysteries. Taken to the lowest vaults of the temple, they underwent rites whose descriptions have been lost, deliberately unrecorded. All that remains are echoes, inscriptions that speak of transformation, of a breath taken into the soul and reshaped into something no longer human. Some returned changed, others never returned. There are fragments of bone-etched journals, recovered from the collapsed tunnels beneath Volsky, that describe a figure named Rakarol, a supplicant, who claimed to have heard the voice not from the mouth of a priest, but in his dreams. He wrote of walls that bled words, of fires that did not burn, and of voices that rose from beneath stone like rivers of memory. His final entry ends mid-sentence, trailing into silence. Some say he was taken. Others believe he became something more or less. As the cult spread across Skyrim, its reach grew not through battle, but through the erosion of resistance. Towns that once worshipped Kine or Mara slowly shifted their altars to reflect the dragon sigil. Priests of the old pantheon either vanished or were absorbed, their doctrines reinterpreted in dragon terms. Even language began to change. Words borrowed from the Thu'um crept into daily speech, lending a sacred weight to common thought. This linguistic invasion was not accidental, it was spiritual architecture. Yet for all their power, the dragon priests feared one thing above all: the silence of their masters. Dragons, though worshipped, were not predictable. They came and went as they pleased, often without explanation. Sometimes they would appear, speak a single word and vanish for decades. At times entire temples would be ignored, even as others basked in fire and blessing. This inconsistency bred unease. The priests, who claimed divine favor, found themselves in competition, each striving to remain worthy, each fearing the shame of abandonment. Some began to twist the rites, deepening the bloodshed, amplifying the chants, searching for new ways to provoke attention from above. The silence did not break. Others sought forbidden knowledge, relics buried beneath the ice, scrolls wrapped in skin, names that had been forbidden even by the dragons themselves. These became known, later, as the Whisperers, those who listened to things beneath even the will of Akatosh. But that is another part of the story. For now the temples still stand, the fires still burn, the masks still gaze, and the sky for this chapter remains unbroken. When snow gathers upon the old stones and the wind sings across the high passes of the Gerol Mountains, there are places where time feels thinner, where memory stirs beneath every footfall. These are not places found upon ordinary maps, nor charted by compass or trade. They are remembered only in the silent passages of song, the scratched lines of half-burned vellum, the dreams of those whose blood carries ancient weight. In these forgotten corridors of the world, the dragon cult grew not just in strength, but in mystery, its roots winding downward into the soul of Skyrim, and into the deeper soul of man. As the temples hardened into power, so too did the cult's vision darken. Their rituals, once shaped around worship and order, began to shift in tone. The dragons, ever distant, began to withdraw. Their visits grew rare. Their words became fewer. Some among the priests believed this was a test, a sacred silence intended to purify and strengthen the faithful. Others, quieter in their doubt, began to fear the truth, that their gods had grown indifferent. Or worse, disappointed. It was during this era of unsettling quiet that the cult turned inward. With no answers from above, they began to seek control below. Where once they governed the land through awe and reverence, they now tightened their grip, with force cloaked as righteousness. Towns that had once welcomed the presence of the priests began to feel the cold of their shadow. Taxes became tributes. Disputes were settled, not by law, but by decree. The word of a dragon priest was final, not only in judgment, but in faith. The most devout among the priests, those whose minds had fused too closely with the will of dragons, began to retreat into seclusion, cloistered deep within their temples, speaking only to their acolytes in ritual tones. Some are said to have sealed their chambers with walls of the voice itself, walls that could not be breached without words now lost. It was during this age that the masks of power became more than symbols. They became obsessions, objects of ritual, anchors of identity. Each priest had their own, and no two masks were the same. Forged by dragonfire and shaped by soulcraft, the masks were imbued with purpose and permanence. They carried not only enchantments, but presence, a resonance of the wearer, a whisper of memory. To wear the mask was to be more than mortal, to speak as one touched by the divine breath. But as with all things sacred and powerful, the masks began to consume the men beneath them. Over time it became unclear where the priest ended and the mask began. There are stories preserved in the amber-lit archives of Dunmyth Pass, of a priest who, upon donning his mask, forgot the sound of his own name. His voice became another's. His thoughts echoed with commands that were not his own. He began to speak only in the dragon tongue, even in sleep, muttering syllables that caused torches to flicker and ink to freeze. His followers recorded his words, believing them prophecy, though none could translate. One day, the priest vanished into his crypt and sealed the door with fire. His name was never spoken again. Yet the cult did not crumble under this growing strangeness. It adapted, it calcified. Where fear had once been silent, it now became a tool. Villages that resisted were made examples. Their chieftains, taken in the night, returned as hollow-eyed husks, obedient, but emptied. Children were taught the names of the priests before their own. Shrines were placed in every halls, small replicas of the great temples, each one carved from volcanic rock, each one etched with runes of obedience and fate. The cult's reach extended into every layer of life. Farmers left the first cut of their harvest at the feet of dragon statues. Hunters whispered Thu'um syllables over their arrows for favor. Mothers sang lullabies that doubled as oaths. Even birth and death were marked not by the divines but by rites of the voice. At birth, a child's breath was measured against a windstone to determine their alignment with the Thu'um. At death, tongues were burned to prevent blasphemy beyond the grave. And yet, in the darkest crypts, some began to stir against this weight. Acolytes, raised without family, began to ask questions forbidden since the cult's dawn. Why did the dragons no longer come? Why did the priests age no longer, yet feel less alive? Why did the masks remain warm, even when the bodies within them grew cold? These questions spread like frost under a locked door, slowly, then suddenly. Among the first to question was a young scribe known only as Nolrin. His writings, found centuries later in a sealed chamber beneath Highgate ruins, are sparse, but poignant. In one entry he wrote, "They speak of order, but I see only silence. They promise clarity, but my mind grows heavy beneath their words. I dream of voices not of dragons, but of men, crying out beneath stone." His final pages describe a journey, a secret path taken out of the temple by night, through forgotten halls and broken walls, searching for the true origin of the cult. He never returned. Others followed. Quiet rebellions began, not of swords, but of silence. acolytes refusing the chant, firekeepers letting the temple flames gutter and die. Scrolls were hidden, then stolen, then rewritten. A strange phrase began to appear, carved discreetly into walls and inked into the margins of sacred texts. Dovsul fin lolverse. The voice of the dragon is a lie. The priests responded with fury. Temples became prisons, whispers became confessions, and confessions ended in ritual erasure. Those found disloyal were not merely executed, they were unmade. Their names were stricken, their memories torn from the chants. The cult sought not only to destroy rebellion, but to erase its possibility. But in doing so, it fed the fire it feared. The masks still sat upon their altars, the words still echoed in the halls, but the dragons, still silent, watched only from the distance of myth, and the priests, in their isolation, grew more inhuman, more bound to their stone thrones, their rituals, their masks. They began to speak less, moving only when the winds carried certain omens. Some remained motionless for years, their eyes unblinking beneath heavy hoods, their breath slow as dust. Outside, in the mountains, in the forests, in the caves where snow never melted, a new current began to stir, small at first, patient, a resistance not yet formed, but forming. And though the temple still stood, their stones began to remember the sound of footsteps that did not belong to worshippers. Not yet war, but not peace, not any. When night falls across the Barrowlands of Skyrim, and the pale light of Secunda filters through clouds like breath caught in the throat of the world, the earth itself seems to listen for what once was, for voices long buried beneath cairn and crypt, for footsteps that no longer tread, but whose echoes remain. It is in this sacred hush that the fourth turning of the dragon cult's story begins. Not with fire, but with memory. Not with power, but with a fracture, fine as a hairline crack in ancient stone. By now the cult had become a monument to its own weight. Its temples no longer reached toward the sky in praise, but curved inward, like withered hands grasping at silence. The dragon priests, once heralds of divine presence, now sat in their sanctums like still statues, listening endlessly for their masters, who no longer called. Some, like Rogot of Forulahost, turned their despair into fervor, tightening control over their people in a desperate bid to maintain purity. Others vanished entirely, their temples locked behind word walls that could only be opened with shouts no mortal dared utter. The common folk, once willing servants, had grown weary. Fear had not lessened, but reverence had waned, crumbling like dry parchment beneath snow. The chants had become rituals of survival, not of faith. The offerings, grain, livestock, children, continued not out of love, but out of dread. And dread, when stretched too thin across generations, begins to wear a different face. It begins to resemble hatred. In the high reaches of Skyrim's eastern range, where the frost never melts, and even the wolves move silently, there is a cave, long hidden by snowdrift and illusion. Within that cavern, according to half-forgotten fragments found in the scrolls of Tel Naga, lay a circle of stone, untouched by dragon rule, a place where whispers took root, whispers of rebellion, not in the loud voice of swords and war cries, but in the soft defiance of a name remembered, a chant undone, a truth spoken behind closed doors. This cave, unnamed in any map, called only Nordrem by those who knew of it, became the secret cradle of the first resistance. Here gathered not warriors but scholars, ex-acolytes, stone singers, those who once carved the word walls but had come to question their meanings. They did not seek to destroy the dragon cult, not yet. They sought to understand it, to disassemble it, within, like pulling bones from beneath muscle. They studied the ruins, left behind in the wake of abandoned shrines. They compared etchings in the dragon language, noting variations that suggested deception or deliberate obfuscation. According to a recovered journal, attributed to Ingmir of Whiterun, they discovered that many of the so-called sacred words, the words of power used by priests to command, had been altered from their original forms. Where once a word meant balance, it had been changed to submission. Where once a glyph meant voice shared, it now read voice owned. The voice, they came to believe, was not the property of the dragons, but a gift given freely to all who bore breath. This revelation, heretical in the eyes of the cult, was not taken lightly. It spread carefully, whispered from mouth to mouth, carried by those who remembered their birth names. They called themselves the Remnants, and they wore no symbols, bore no flags, only silence and purpose. But knowledge alone is no shield. One by one, the priests began to sense the drift. Though their dragons still slept or wandered, the old magic that connected them to the land remained intact. They felt the tremors of descent, like cracks in ancient stone beneath their feet. And so the cult, already fraying at the edges, turned inward once more, into something colder, darker, and more desperate. Temples became fortresses, no longer mere places of worship. They were reshaped into strongholds of isolation. The outer halls were fortified with stone magic, and deeper within, Draga were awakened, not by time, but by command. These were not the slow drifting husks that wander now through ruins. In those days they were swift, sharp, still bound by oaths given in life. Bound to the will of the mask bearer. To control the Draga, the priests underwent new rites, ancient, forbidden ones. Rites that involved not just voice, but soul shearing, binding their essence to the undead through shards of the original theme. It is said that the priests could see through the eyes of the Draga, hear through their hollow ears, speak through their cracked mouths. Their presence became many, one will fractured across 1,000 empty bodies, surveillance made sacred. Still, the remnants moved. Beneath the soil, in the buried libraries of New Zealand and the wind-bitten tunnels and the skybound watch, they uncovered the oldest words. Words unspoken for centuries. Words that could break stone, or soothe frost, or silence pain. Words that belonged not to dragon nor god, but to the breath of man, the firstborn sound of Nirn. These were the root words of resistance. And with those root words they began to teach. Not in open halls or torchlit forums, but in dreams, through trance, through chant, through rhythm carved into stone and repeated across generations. Some say that the greatest among the remnants could pass knowledge with a touch, that their voices were not heard with ears, but with the marrow of the spine. Slowly, one soul at a time, the sacred wound of the cult began to widen, but not without cost. The dragon priests, sensing their dominion slipping, began to unravel. Some abandoned their temples and walked into the mountains, chanting wordlessly until their tongues froze to silence. Others deepened their pacts with the unknown, reaching beyond the dragons themselves to older things, forgotten things. Daedric echoes, trapped in stone, black speech not of Nords or Dove, but of something older than the voice. These were the whispering ones, priests whose masks had fused entirely to their faces, whose eyes shone not with fire, but with void. They became monstrous in soul, though they retained the shape of men. Their temples grew darker, filled with fog and rot. Animals fled from their borders. Their names were no longer spoken, only carved backward in ruins, as warnings. And yet, their power grew, for in their desperation, they had found something else. Not a dragon, not a god, but an answer. Its name would not be spoken, only written, in fragments, in claw marks, in dreams. And as the frost deepened across the high passes, and the wind grew louder in the stone valleys, it became clear to both cult and remnant alike, this was no longer a question of loyalty. This was the beginning of a war, not of armies, but of breath, not yet spoken aloud, but rising like the silence before the shout. When the sky holds its breath above the jagged heights of Skyrim, and the stars hang still, as if frozen by some ancient command, one can almost hear the murmuring of the earth, low, rhythmic, and wordless. It is the sound of history settling into stone. In this sacred pause between snowfall and remembrance, the 5th chapter of the dragon cult's myth unfurls, a chapter of unraveling foundations, of memory turned against itself, and of a silence so heavy it began to reshape the world beneath it. The remnants, once scattered whispers in the shadows, had begun to coalesce into something more persistent. They had no leaders, no thrones, no temples, yet their knowledge spread like fire that burned without light, consuming ignorance in secret, leaving no visible trace. In the far reaches of the Reach, where the land buckles and bleeds, Ancient cairns once sealed by priests were reopened. Inside, scrolls written in a dialect older than High Nordic were found, lines of script curved like smoke, etched with bone onto blackened leather. These texts told of a time before the dragon cult, a time when the voice was not command, but communion, when it was shared in song among the people, not hoarded behind stone and mask. The remnants took this as proof. The dragons had not created the voice. They had stolen it. And so, a deeper kind of heresy was born, not just rebellion against the cult, but a revision of the very myth that had justified its existence. To the priests, this was an existential wound. The voice was their claim, their weapon, their tether to divinity. To question its origin was to unmake their right to rule, and as these truths spread, cracks appeared in more than stone. Some among the outer acolytes, those tasked with enforcing decrees, collecting offerings, and maintaining word walls, began to hesitate. A few even vanished, leaving behind only scratched lines in the stone, drawn with fingertips. Zu duan kriv oth sil. I am of a death with soul. Not all acts of defiance were silent. In the valley near Heol, where the river freezes even in summer, and no birds have sung since the days of the first barrow, an acolyte named Vethros stood before the high altar of his temple and removed his mask. Before a gathering of worshippers and priests, he spoke not in the tongue of dragons, but in the soft, round words of the old tongue, a lullaby once sung to him by a mother he had forgotten. He did not shout, he did not burn, he simply left. His departure rang louder than any rebellion. The priests responded with swift and brutal force, purging the temple from within. Every stone was re-etched, every scroll rewritten. Those who had witnessed were either buried beneath the floor or drowned in ritual silence. Yet the damage had been done. The illusion that all were loyal, that all believed, was broken. In response, the cult began a new wave of purifications. Acolytes were tested not by chant or breath, but by memory. Those who could not recite the sacred sequences of the Thu'um were declared fractured and removed. Firekeepers were replaced by Draga, animated to serve without thought. The living were proving too unpredictable. It was in this climate of fear and retreat that the first barrow seals were invoked. These were not simple locks or runes, but layered enchantments written into the very bones of the temple stones. Spells that bound not only space but time. They sealed away knowledge the cult could no longer protect, locking it behind riddles and sacrificial rites. The barrow seals were inscribed with names not of places or people, but of ideas: Saran, grace; Karnar, reverence; Mulag, strength. Only by speaking these concepts with absolute spiritual purity could one gain entry. But the seals were flawed, for in locking their knowledge away, the priests had also locked away part of themselves. As the cult walled itself off, its priests began to change. Isolation fed something old and strange within them. Those who had once ruled with poise became consumed by obsession. Some sought to perfect the voice, chanting to themselves without pause, their throats bleeding from repetition. Others carved dragon runes into their own flesh, hoping to become vessels more worthy of divine speech. A few sealed themselves into tombs while still alive, believing death would bring them closer to the truth. Their humanity faded, their eyes grew distant, their presence became unbearable to the living. And still the dragons remained silent. That silence, once seen as mystery, then as test, now felt like abandonment. The priests whispered among themselves that Aldiran, firstborn of Akatosh, had vanished into the spaces between time, that the other dragons, once their companions, had fled or turned inward, no longer moved by mortal devotion. What was left then? Only masks, only stone, only ritual. And ritual, in the absence of meaning, becomes hunger. In this hunger, something ancient stirred. Beneath the black barrow of Solnak's hollow, deep beyond the reach of wind or light, lay a relic forgotten even by the oldest priests. A stone carved not in dragon language, but in something older, a language shaped by echo and shadow. The priests who found it could not read it, but they felt its pull. They named it Kainmar, the Stone of Silence. They brought it into the temple and placed it upon a dais of gold. From that day forward, none who entered the sanctum spoke again. Something had entered their dreams. They began to draw symbols that bore no root in known language. Spirals, eyes, shapes that changed when not looked at directly. They ceased eating, ceased aging. Some believe they ceased dying. It is said the priests of Kamar remain, neither alive nor dead, wrapped in silence so complete it echoes. The remnants called them the Hollowed, and they marked the temple with an ancient rune of warning, a mouth closed and bleeding. It is here that the fracture in the cult becomes impossible to ignore. The priests no longer spoke with one voice. Some sought to preserve the old ways, clinging to dragon worship with fading strength. Others descended into darkness, chasing power wherever it might be found, and beyond all of them, in caves and ruins and quiet valleys, the remnants prepared. They did not march. They did not burn. They whispered. And through whisper, the world began to turn. The stones were no longer silent. The breath of man, once stilled, once bent, began to stir. When dawn failed to rise over the jagged fangs of the Velethi mountains, and the clouds hung low like the eyelids of dreaming gods, a subtle transformation pressed into the snow-bound fabric of Skyrim. The dragon cult, once unshakable as the stone it carved, began to falter, not by war or conquest, but by erosion of the soul. And in this sacred twilight between power and decay, the 6th chapter unfolds like old vellum, cracked at the edges, whispering truths that no longer wish to be remembered. The temples still stood, shrouded in silence and frost, their doors sealed not by lock or key, but by words etched into the air itself, written with breath and belief. And yet something within them had shifted. The priests, once luminous with power drawn from the Thu'um and the favor of dragons, had grown dim. Their rituals continued, but the energy that once answered their incantations no longer stirred. The air did not ripple. The walls did not tremble. The voice, once a torrent, had thinned to a whisper, and in that thinning the remnants found their path. Theirs was not a rebellion of banners or steel, but of symbols and secrets. Through the veins of old roads, the moss-covered stone paths that still linked temple to tomb, they moved in pairs, never speaking above a hush. They carried with them relics of a forgotten memory, the root word la, meaning matika, as mercy, and the symbol for di, grace without dominance. These were not weapons, but tools, keys to the undoing of a tyranny built on sacred misunderstanding. In their hidden sanctums, the remnants began to unearth the original rhythm of the voice. They meditated, not for power, but for peace. They chanted not to command, but to harmonize. Slowly, painfully, they reassembled a philosophy that predated the cult, that the voice was not a tool of dragons alone, but a gift to all mortals, a means to align the soul with the echo of creation. It was not a heresy of defiance, it was a return. This reawakening spread like frost across sleeping stone. Some of the youngest acolytes in the outer temples began to feel it, a dissonance, a pull. Dreams came unbidden, filled with wind and fire, but without In these dreams they saw dragons not as masters, but as fellow voices, brothers of breath, not tyrants of it. The priests, sensing this quiet unraveling, tightened their hold. They withdrew deeper into their sanctums, surrounding themselves with droga and enchantments that stilled the air, deafening the world to anything but their own ancient liturgy. But their control, like cracked glass, could not withstand what moved beneath. In the ruins beneath Thu'um, once a proud beacon of the cult, a chamber was uncovered by accident. An acolyte, seeking warmth, broke through a wall softened by age. Beyond it, they found a hollow space lined with inscriptions, not in the tongue of dragons, but in the proto-language of early man. These walls spoke not of conquest, but of harmony. They described a time when dragons and mortals shared the sky, singing the wind into form together. This chamber was sealed almost immediately. The acolyte was taken, his name erased. But the knowledge had already escaped, carved into the memory of those who had glimpsed it, even for a moment. And knowledge, once remembered, cannot be unremembered. As the remnants grew in spirit, they began to sing again, not in public, not where the ear of the priests could catch them, but in caverns where the wind carried sound into silence, in forests where the trees bent to listen. Their songs were not loud. They were lullabies, old melodies passed down before the cult ever built its first wall. And within those notes, ancient words returned, syllables that soothed, that mended, that healed. They called it the deep breath, a practice of centering one's spirit in the void between words, a sacred stillness as old as Nirn itself. Through this, the remnants remembered who they were and who they were meant to be, not slaves to flame, but bearers of the breath, not wielders of the voice, but partners with it. Meanwhile, the cult spiraled further inward. The priests, desperate to reclaim the certainty they once held, began forging new masks. These were not the artifacts of old, crafted under dragon fire and blessed with names. These were imitations, rushed, unstable, filled not with soul but with desperation. Many shattered upon first wearing, others fused incorrectly, searing the mind, or causing the wearer to lose all speech entirely. Still, they persisted. Their faith had become an obsession. Their rituals hollow incantations repeated to gods who had already turned away. Some temples fell to ruin, not through assault, but through disuse. Walls collapsed under the weight of time and snow. Fires dimmed until only ash remained, and within the deepest chambers, the priests began to sleep. Not in death, but in something worse, a kind of undeath, sustained by enchantment and sorrow, waiting for a time when the dragons might return. But the dragons did not return. Not in fire, not in voice, only in memory. And memory, sacred and slow, belonged now to the remnants. They began to inscribe the world with new marks, not on stone, but in song. They taught children in the hidden valleys the true names of wind and flame. They whispered to the rivers and sang to the stars. And the world, so long silenced by the cult's domination, began to answer, not with speech, but with presence, with renewal. Still, the cult was not dead. In the north, where the ice never melts and the sky speaks only in echoes, a single voice cried out, a true voice unshaped by man, untouched by priest or dragon. It was heard once, by a traveller who wandered too far and returned with his eyes glazed with frost. He spoke of a presence older than the world, bound in sleep, beneath a mask not made by hands. He called it the first word, and then he said nothing more. The remnants gathered, silent. They did not speak of conquest. They did not call for destruction. Instead, they listened, for the breath beneath all things, for the word that had not yet been spoken. Not yet. But soon, ChatGPT said, when the wind sweeps low across the stone spines of Hrothgar, and the world holds still between inhale and exhale, it is said that the mountain itself remembers, not in thought, but in rhythm, a cadence older than voice, older even than the dragons who first gave it shape. Beneath its snow-veined bones, echoes stir that once belonged to voices lost. It is within this quiet remembering that the 7th chapter begins, a turning in shadow, a deepening of silence, and the quiet convergence of breath and will. The dragon cult, though decaying in presence, remained fortified in ritual. Its surviving temples had grown colder, not from frost, but from abandonment of soul. The priests no longer sought wisdom, only control. Their voices, once thunder on mountaintops, now muttered endlessly behind sealed walls, repeating broken words of power to no audience but the undead. They had become echoes of themselves, shadows wearing masks, masks that remembered more than the men beneath them. Some priests no longer removed their masks. Even in solitude, they believed that the separation between flesh and soul had already dissolved. Their identities became not names, but functions. Croesus, Hevnoric, Volsung, not as titles, but as conditions of being. They no longer wrote, they no longer wept. They spoke only when the wind demanded it. Their dreams were filled with fireless dragons and temples without walls. Meanwhile, the remnants continued their work, slow, deliberate, like root threading through stone. They moved carefully through Skyrim's underlands, gathering the forgotten fragments of the old voice. Not just the Thu'um, but the Rotha, the deep tonal knowledge used before words. A harmonic understanding of existence passed through gesture, silence, and placement of sound within space. They taught it not as magic, but as memory, a way of realigning the self with the world's unspoken rhythm. In the moss-grown ruins of Grove, a fragment of this practice was rediscovered, a tonal map carved into the arch of a wind altar. It depicted not commands, but invitations, sound as offering, not. The remnants replicated the patterns in song, gathering in threes, spaced evenly across natural stone. They sang low, slow, without direction, not seeking to move the world, but to resonate with it. And the world began to answer. Animals no longer fled their camps. Storms passed over without breaking, fires burned clean and without smoke. In one instance, a dying tree flowered briefly in winter. They did not call this power, they called it remembrance. The cult, now desperate to reclaim its slipping dominion, turned to old tombs, those sealed during the early rise of their faith. They believed these chambers contained the purest breath, untouched by dissent or decay. Draga-guarded barrows were opened under moonless skies, and rites were conducted in the name of names long buried. Priests began awakening those who had never intended to rise, early mask-bearers, sealed not for death, but for containment. These awakenings did not always go as intended. Some of the old ones emerged changed, confused, speaking in riddles, walking backwards through corridors of stone. Others wept endlessly, their Thu'um unraveling the walls around them. One priest, known only by the glyph Vosla, was said to rise and scream a single word for 3 days straight, until the surrounding hills collapsed into the sea. The cult realized, too late, that even their dead no longer remembered loyalty. And still, the dragons remained distant. A few were seen in the far skies, silent shapes above the snow, watching, waiting. They did not descend. They did not speak. It was unclear whether they disapproved or had simply forgotten how to care. One priest, in a rare moment of self-reflection, carved into the wall of his crypt. The sky no longer speaks, and so we speak louder, but louder is not clearer. In this void of divine reply, splinter sects began to rise within the cult groups that no longer worshipped the dragons themselves, but the idea of the dragon. They abandoned the Thu'um, instead seeking communion through bloodlines and breath-sharing. These sects believed that by blending dragon soul with mortal form, they could recreate the original bond. Their rites were grotesque, not sacrifices, but transfigurations, attempts to shape mortal bodies into vessels that might recall dragonhood. These efforts failed. Horrible. The echoes of their failure still drift through certain ruins, where walls breathe and voices call out in voices not their own. The remnants, upon discovering these places, wept. They did not seek dominion. They sought only balance. And so they began a different work. In the ancient forest near Eldergleam, they built no temple, no shrine, only a circle of stone open to the stars. Here they taught those who still listened how to listen in return. Not to the dragons, not to the priests, but to themselves. They taught that every soul bore a word, and that word, once remembered, was the key to harmony. This sacred word was not to be shouted, but breathed, spoken only once, in silence. A personal Thu'um, never shared. Some found theirs in dreams, others heard it in wind, a few never found it, but listened for it all their lives, and in listening became complete. The cult, sensing this loss of spiritual monopoly, grew fearful, and fear in ancient men bred something more dangerous than tyranny. It bred desperation. Certain priests began turning to forbidden tongues, black scripted dialects unearthed from beneath the sea of ghosts, words that did not belong to Nirn, nor to time. These were not words, echoing from a place beyond the edge of song. When spoken, they unraveled things, not violently, but subtly. Maps faded, names forgot themselves, fires refused to cast shadow. And so the war deepened, not in armies, not in blades, but in meaning, a war for breath, a war for memory, a war for the right to speak, not just power, but truth. When night no longer passed into day, but into softer shades of grey and goldless dawn, the land itself seemed caught in the stillness of thought. Trees no longer swayed, they listened. Mountains did not rise higher, and the wind, ever the sacred herald of voice and silence, began to move differently, slower, deeper, as if cautious of the words it carried. In this hushed and listening world, the 8th chapter begins. Not in revelation, but in quiet tension, a breath held between two unknown futures. By this time, the dragon cult had become something other than itself. It no longer resembled the early order of reverence and awe, nor the later tyranny of mask and flame. It had become a vessel without memory, an empty shell still echoing with borrowed power. The priests, bound to masks they no longer understood, had grown more statue than spirit. Their voices cracked when raised. Their commands echoed in empty halls, and in the deeper crypts, where even the Draga would not stir, a different kind of silence had begun to bloom. The silence of things ending. It was within this closing silence that the remnants found their moment. They did not seize it. They did not rush. They breathed, for their strength had never been in force. It had always been in rhythm, in memory, in the unbroken chain of sacred thought, passed down from voice to voice. Not in shouting, but in hearing. And now, in the quiet decay of the cult, they returned to places long lost. One such place was Varnil's Reach, a hollow cleft beneath the mountains of Harfingar, known only in a single surviving scrap of etched bone. Within this cave, they found a circle of stones, each bearing a name, lost to history. The names were not written in dragon script, nor in the tongue of the 9 divines, but in a language made entirely of silence, the spacing of marks, the rhythm of breath between carved glyphs. It took them months to interpret even the first. The voice that listens hears farther than the voice that commands. It became a sacred tenet among them, and, as their teaching spread, more gathered. Not warriors, but wanderers. Those who had once followed the cult and grown weary. Those who had never belonged to any order, yet felt the pull of deeper harmony. Among them were old acolytes, who had burned their robes, firekeepers, who no longer lit the sacred braziers, and even former cult scribes, who began to copy new scrolls. Scrolls without demands, without punishment, only layered questions and remembered songs. But nothing remains hidden forever. The cult, fragmented but not extinguished, had eyes yet, and in the deep places, where its last strength coiled, a new doctrine began to emerge. It was called the Reclaiming, a belief not in the return of dragons but in their replacement. The idea that the priests themselves could ascend, not by divine right, but by ritual transformation. That through complete sacrifice of self, they might become as gods, not echoing the dragons, but becoming them in spirit and form. It was a heresy even within the cult, but in their desperation it gained followers. Priests began to abandon their names entirely, taking only syllables of the dragon tongue, not as title, but as identity. Their blood was mixed with remnants of ancient wormbone, their skin painted with ash and soul oil. They fasted for months. They screamed the sky with voices that shattered their teeth. Many died. Some did not. Those who survived changed, not into dragons, but into something else. Half-spoken, half-shaped. Their limbs grew too long, their eyes too dark. They walked without sound. They did not sleep, they did not age, and when they spoke, stone wilted. They became known to the remnants as Thu'um, Vokrun, overlords of shadow, not because they ruled, but because wherever they passed, light grew sick. Their temples became nests of forgotten fire. Their followers wore masks, not of reverence, but of bone, and they carried with them a single command: reclaim the breath. And so the war changed again. It was no longer a conflict between silence and shout, between domination and remembrance. It became a war of becoming, a battle for the shape of voice itself. The remnants held no weapons. They offered no curses. They responded with stillness, with ritual, with song. They built gardens where shrines once stood. They filled broken word walls with flowers. They laid down their lives not in battle but in witness, standing beneath the night sky, singing the names of those lost, not to awaken them, but to release them. And Skyrim began to feel it, not in thunder, but in thaw. The snow melted a little sooner that year. The animals bore young without fear. Streams once poisoned by cursed ash ran clear again. The very mountains seemed to breathe, not as they had in the Age of Dragons, but as they did before the first mask was ever carved. And yet the Thu'um moved still. They whispered of a final rite, one that would unmake the remnants, not through violence, but through silence deeper than any known. A silence that would fold over the land like a second skin. One that would strip every word, every name, every breath from memory. They called it narration, the forever quiet. It was not spoken of openly. Only once was it inscribed, on the wall of a ruined temple found by the remnants, deep in the Reach. The glyphs were burned into the stone, not carved, and beneath them, the bones of a priest who had failed to complete the rite. But the attempt had left a scar, for in that place, no voice could rise. Not even the wind, not even birds, not even thought. It was a wound in the world, and the remnants looking upon it knew this. The war would not end in conquest, nor in return. It would end in breath, or in the lack of it, a choice, whispered to the bones of mountains. When twilight no longer marked the boundary between day and night, but became a season in its own right, long, still, and amber-hued, the land remembered how to wait. Trees bent not from wind, but from memory. Rivers carved deeper, not from rain, but from repetition. And in that lingering dusk, between what was and what must come, the 9th chapter unfolds like breath held too long. It begins not with movement, but with attention, the sacred discipline of listening to a world on the verge of transformation. The dragon cult, fractured and hollow, now resembled not a religion, but a dream half-remembered. Its temples, once alive with chanting and firelight, stood cold. Draga shuffled through corridors once lined with supplicants, bound not by purpose but by inertia. The masks of the priests no longer shone. Their enchantments flickered like dying stars. But still, something within them refused to release its grip, a thread of old power, drawn tight across centuries of silence. In the deepest barrows, places where no feet had trod since the founding of the cult, remnants of a different kind were stirring, not the remnants who walked the living world, but remnants of thought itself, trapped voices, shards of identity, left behind by priests who had spoken words too great for their minds to bear. These were not ghosts, they were echoes with weight, thoughts that walked, remembered only by stone and dust. One such presence was encountered in the buried sanctum of Sarnor, a ruin so old its entrance had collapsed into myth. A group of remnants, led by a silent sage known only as Ilsha, uncovered the forgotten passage during the winter of the pale moon. Within they found not tombs, but mirrors, slabs of polished black crystal that hummed when breath passed too near. When Ilsha touched the central mirror, a phrase formed on its surface, as if etched in frost. "You remember me, so I remain." And from within, the echo of a voice emerged. Not loud, not clear, but rhythmic. Not speech, but pattern. The cadence of grief, the sound of a soul unspoken, bound to the shape of a forgotten word. Ilsha did not flee. She sat in silence before the mirror for 3 days, neither eating nor speaking. On the 4th she rose, marked her skin with a single glyph, Zok meaning still, and sealed the passage behind her. From that day onward her voice changed. It no longer echoed. When she spoke, sound bent around her. She was called thereafter the one who carries breath inside, a living echo shaped not by will, but by understanding. The remnants took this as a sign, not of victory, but of urgency. For the cult had begun its final weaving. The Thu'um, overlords of shadow, now numbered 7, each dwelling in a ruined temple tied to one of the sacred tones of the original voice. They no longer called themselves priests. They no longer prayed. They had become words themselves, walking consonants, shaped by silence and intent. It is said their presence alone was enough to still the air, to cause the blood of mortals to forget how to move. Each Thu'um was preparing a piece of the great unspoken rite, narration, the forever quiet. A silence not of absence, but of erasure. A silence that would overwrite memory itself. Their temples were renamed, not in speech, but in glyphs etched into the very ley lines of the land. One such temple, once known as Vokenthal, was now marked by a single spiral of ash, that no storm could scatter. Inside, the walls no longer stood. They floated, disjointed, held together by will alone, and within the center chamber, the Thu'um, known only as Arneen, whispered to the void for hours without breath. No remnant who entered that place returned, except one. A child, nameless, found at the edge of the ruins, humming a tune unknown to the living. The child bore no wound, no fear, no speech, only a song, and within that melody, the remnants recognized something ancient. The first tone, Sarg, the original syllable of awakening. It meant, I am known, and so, they gathered. Not to fight, but to remember, all across Skyrim's forgotten spaces, in groves where no birds sang, in caves where water fell upward, in barrows lined with salt instead of stone, the remnants began the gathering of breath. They stood in circles, each centered around one who carried the old song, and began the slow, sacred chanting of names. Not names of power, not names of kings, but names of moment, the sound of fire on the first snow. The name of a child who had never been spoken aloud, the syllable shaped by the wind through stone. The day the dragons first fell silent. This was their resistance, a remembering so complete, it defied the void. The Thu'um sensed it. Their silence cracked. One by one they turned their gaze toward the places where memory sang, not with rage, not with fear, but with hunger. For they knew that silence, to remain sovereign, must consume all contrast. And memory was contrast made sacred. The final movement had begun, not with armies, not with death, but with the breath between forgetting and being forgotten. When the frost no longer bit but blessed, and the stars above Skyrim seemed to dim not from cloud, but from reverence, a deeper hush took hold of the land, not born of fear, but of recognition. For what once had been a tale of domination and silence, now turned inward, curling into myth, into breath, into the sacred pause before a final word is spoken. In this moment of trembling stillness, the 10th chapter begins, a chapter of convergence, of memory made whole, and of the quiet reckoning beneath every ancient stone. The remnants, scattered like ash across the frozen spine of the north, had grown into something more than movement, more than resistance. They were no longer few, not in number, but in knowing. Their way was no longer hidden. It was simply not loud. Their message did not travel through proclamation, but through presence. One would see them not as an army, but as a pattern, a rhythm among ruins, a cadence in breath. And now, they gathered, at the foot of Mount Velathrin, where snow does not fall but hovers, held aloft by currents of breath unseen. The remnants came together in silence, not to speak, not to chant, but to listen. For it had been written, not in stone or scroll, but in air and echo, that a time would come when the voice would split itself, part to command, part to remember. And in that division, one half would fade, unless held by those who had never sought to own it. Velathrin had once been a seat of the cult, a temple carved from the bones of the mountain itself, where 7 high priests had spoken with dragons and turned thought into law. But the stone had cracked long ago, not from time, but from misuse. The dragons had left, the priests had faded, and in their absence, the mountain exhaled. It is said that when the remnants stood there, hands open, eyes closed, the wind circled them not as weather, but as witness. They did not call it summoning. They called it answering, and something did answer. Far to the west, beyond the bluffs of Sulcrin's mouth, one of the 7 Thu'um stirred. Known only by the syllable bow, meaning of sorrow, this shadow priest had remained dormant for decades, bound in meditation deep within the collapsed crypt of Uskendar. His body was no longer flesh, but echo. His voice, a low hum that turned stone to dust. And now, sensing the gathering of breath, Bo rose. He did not walk, he arrived. Across the land, those attuned to the deeper tones felt it. A sudden void in the pulse of the world, as if a breath had been drawn and never exhaled. Birds fell silent, rivers slowed, fires flickered and forgot how to burn. The remnants did not retreat, they stood still, for their strength was not in sound, but in stillness. Bo approached Velathrin, not as a conqueror, but as inevitability. Around him words bent, trees forgot their roots, moss whispered prayers in languages no longer known. He did not threaten, he did not rage, he waited, and in that waiting, a single remnant stepped forward, not a sage, not a singer, not a priest, a child, the same child who had once walked from the temple of Vakantol, humming a tune older than dawn. She stood before Bo, eyes unblinking, breath steady, and from her lips came not a shout, not a word of power, but a hum, the same lullaby she had never been taught. And within that hum, the tones sang, the first tone rose again. I am known. And Bo faltered, not in power, not in form, but in certainty, for this was not resistance. This was recognition, and in that sacred meeting, a memory stirred within the Thu'um, not of command, not of worship, but of who they had once been before the masks, before the rites, before silence became weapon. For Bo had not always been shadow, he had once sung, and for a moment the hum of the child and the stillness of the mountain became one. Then Bo turned and vanished, not in fear, in surrender. A piece of the silence had remembered how to listen. Elsewhere the other 6 Thu'um stirred, some in confusion, some in fear, one in rage. For the rite of narration, the forever quiet, had already begun. It was not a single spell or ceremony. It was a weaving, an unmaking of all that held breath and voice together. And now, that weaving trembled. The remnants, knowing the cost of this unraveling, began the next step in their quiet resistance. They began to build the weir of names, a vast field of carved stones, unmarked by title or law. Each stone held not a person, but a word, one spoken by someone who had loved, lost, waited, sung, or remembered. It was not a monument, it was a map, a tapestry of tone, a chorus without song, and as each name was placed, the wind began to change. It grew warmer, slower, listening. The world did not shake, the skies did not open, but the Thu'um began to hesitate, for in their silence, they felt something ancient returning, not dragons, not gods, but breath, pure, unbound, remembered, and that, not war, would be the final turning. When breath becomes prayer and silence becomes answer, the land begins to dream. Not in symbols or visions, but in tone, a hymn beneath the earth, a low vibration in the stones, the rhythm of memory returning to itself. Skyrim, ancient and weary, had entered such a dreaming. The snow no longer fell as before, it settled like ash from fires long extinguished. The rivers flowed, not outward but inward, as if seeking their source. In this sacred descent into stillness, the 11th chapter unfolds, a chapter not of clash, but of convergence. The remnants, now stewards of a truth older than the dragon cult's rise, worked quietly among the ruins of breath. At the weir of names, stones continued to be placed, not to record, but to remember. Each word etched was a sound once spoken in love, in grief, in reverence. Small utterances that had survived time because they had meaning, not power. They did not ask for followers. They did not build walls. Their strength lay in their rhythm, in their return to what the voice once was. Not a weapon, but a mirror. Each breath a reflection of the soul that shaped it. And still, far across the land, the rite of narration deepened. The Thu'um had not halted their silent labour. 6 remained, 6 shadows whose names were no longer words, but absences. They moved unseen, working beneath stone and within storm. Each laid a thread of the rite's great silence, not through spell or speech, but by removing meaning from memory. Wherever they passed, old stories faded, names blurred, songs forgotten for centuries dissolved utterly. One such place was the shrine of Moltarak, a minor temple once sacred to those who sang the stars into patterns. The remnants had visited it weeks before, placing 3 stones bearing words of light, Len to shine, Ka to move, and Torin to remain. But when they returned, the shrine was gone, not collapsed, not burned. Gone. Even the hill on which it stood had become smooth, as if no structure had ever existed there. The air was still, and cold. Too cold for birdsong, too cold for thought. They called it a wound of breath, and they knew now the Thu'um would not stop. Their silence was not dormancy, it was hunger, and hunger, once awakened, does not reason, it consumes. So the remnants turned once more to the mountain, not to Velathrin, where breath had been remembered, but to an older place, Kraltsil, the echoing hollow, a vast natural cavern formed not by erosion, but by tone. It had long been known only in passing myth, spoken of in the oldest Reach folk ballads as the mouth beneath stone, a place where the first word was said to have rested after being spoken into existence. No walls, no altars, only silence, so perfect. It returned every breath 100-fold, led by Ilsha, the silent sage, and the child who still sang without knowing why. The remnants descended. They carried no torches, no weapons, only the wind to guide them. Within Kraltsil, they did not speak. They sat, they breathed, and in that breath, the hollow stirred, not with voice, with memory. It came not as sound, but as sensation, the weight of being witnessed by something vast and ancient, something that did not speak in words, but in recognition. They felt themselves opened, not broken, not judged, simply seen. And in that sacred seeing, the rite of narration faltered. One of the 6 Thu'um, known only by the void name Zune, broke from his station near the icebound ruins of Falgon Reach. He did not speak. He did not flee. He wept. And from his shadowed throat came a tone so low, so fragile, that the snow around him melted in rings. It was not a word of power. It was an apology. The first, and perhaps the last. The others felt it. Across Skyrim, the Thu'um trembled. The web of the forever quiet rippled, not shattered, not undone, but questioned. For silence, when confronted by true memory, must either deepen into truth or recede into fear. And so the remnants returned to the weir, where the stones now numbered in the hundreds, no longer arranged by language or tone, but by breath. Each stone placed by the one who had spoken the word, each breath released with reverence. They knew they could not stop the rite through force, but they could outlive it, through memory, through stillness, through breath that chose to be. It was not a battle, it was a remembering. And in that, they found their place, not as saviors, but as echoes that choose to remain. The wind carried this knowing far, though none could say how. Some claimed it reached even the bones of Alduin, folded in time. Others believed the mountain itself hummed, softly, in gratitude. But no remnant spoke of victory, only of the tone that rises after silence, and the breath that comes after fear. A tone not yet heard, but waiting, always waiting. When time becomes distance, and distance becomes dream, even the stones begin to remember, not through words carved into their flanks, but through the way moss clings to shadow, and how wind passes over their surface without sound. In these long-forgotten rhythms, breath without speaker, silence without absence, Skyrim drew closer to something it had not known for an age, a memory too sacred to be told aloud. It is within this hush, this vast inward turning, that the 12th chapter is born, like frost blooming on ancient glass. The remnants, guardians not of doctrine but of tone, had begun to understand what others had long feared. The rite of narration, the forever quiet, was not a single act, but a condition, a sickness of forgetting. Not forgetting as lapse, but forgetting as cleansing, the erasure of meaning, the severance of voice from breath. It moved slowly like roots beneath stone, and where it passed, stories vanished. A village near the border of Eastmarch was the next to fall. The village had no name in the old records, but its people had once sung the morning into being with a song known only to that valley. The remnants had passed through months before, recording the melody through memory, not ink. But when they returned, the houses were gone, not ruined, simply not there. The trees still stood, and the stream still ran, but the village had become a clearing, the song replaced by a stillness so perfect, even the birds refused to land. One remnant, a singer called Violin, sat in the center of that place for 7 days, whispering the melody into the earth. On the 8th day, Wildflowers bloomed where the houses had stood. He did not smile. He only breathed. It was not enough to stop the rite, but it was enough to remember. Elsewhere, the Thu'um pressed deeper into the bones of Skyrim, weaving their silence into stone and snow alike. The fifth of their number, Sortlok, whose name meant unbinding of sound, had begun reshaping the sky above the western steppes. Travelers reported seeing stars vanish mid-pattern, constellations undone and reordered, as if the very heavens were forgetting how to tell stories. This was no display of power. It was erasure, and a making of the sky's memory. And beneath it, the people began to lose their names. Not suddenly, not loudly, just absence. A shepherd could no longer recall his own voice. A child began to speak in echoes of her father, not her own tone. A woman sang the song of her grandmother, then forgot it belonged to anyone at all. The remnant saw this, and wept not in sorrow, but in knowing. This was the true danger. Not death, not tyranny, but drift. The soul made hollow, through loss of tone, so they returned once more to the heart of the world. To Kroltsil, the echoing hollow. There, Ilsha, the silent sage, began what she called the reweaving. She did not write. She did not speak. She arranged stones in concentric spirals, each layer a reflection of the breath that came before it. Others joined her, matching each gesture, each placement, to a memory spoken without voice. It was a kind of song, not sung, but a ritual of tone, made physical. For 3 weeks they worked beneath the earth, unseen by sun, untouched by shadow, and when it was complete, the cavern sang. Not with music, but with resonance, the world itself recalling its shape. A tone rose from the stones, not loud, not sharp, but enduring. A breath that would not fade. The Thu'um felt it. Far away, Lukra, whose name bore the echo of frozen peace, turned his gaze to the east. He had been silent for centuries, seated in a throne of ash at the bottom of the sea of ghosts. Where even waves dared not form, he had given his voice long ago to the right, becoming a vessel of stillness so profound it distorted light. But now, light returned to his sanctum. The sea moved, and Lukra knew the world had not consented to forgetting. In Kroltsil, the remnants raised no banners, built no shrines. They placed no names upon the walls, but they breathed, and the breath was enough. Elsewhere, children who had never heard the old songs began to hum them in sleep. Winds over the Jural Mountains carried tones that matched no known weather. Elder trees in the rift dropped leaves in spirals, patterns that mirrored the sacred glyphs long thought lost. The world was remembering itself, not through resistance, but through rhythm. The remnants understood. They could not fight the right, but they could outlast it, because silence has no shape of its own. It only erases what is not already held, and so they held, not with force, but with stillness made sacred, with the breath before naming, and the tone before time, and in that breath, the right trembled, not with fear, but with the possibility of failure, for even silence, when confronted with love, must choose. In the deepest hour of night, when even shadows lean into the quiet, the land holds its breath. It is a breath not born of fear, but of reverence, a sacred inhalation that stretches beyond moments into ages. Here in this tender stillness, the 14th chapter begins. A chapter woven not from thunder or flame, but from the soft persistence of memory that refuses to fade. The dragon cult, once a tempest of wills and voices, had long since become a tapestry of frayed threads and half-remembered prayers. Its temples crumbled into the earth, like falling stars, its priests mere echoes lost to dust and stone. Yet beneath this ruin the rite of Nakrian endured, an ever-tightening silence, weaving itself through the bones of Skyrim. It was not a war of bodies or blades, but of breath and forgetting, a slow unraveling of the song that gave the world shape. Among the remnants, a new awakening stirred, not of strength, but of understanding. In the valley of Rorikstead, where the rivers sang soft lullabies to wheat fields and the mountains stood guard like ancient sentinels, a gathering took place, unlike any before. Not a congregation of voices raised in protest, but a meeting of breath shared in quiet communion. Here, the oldest remnants, Those who bore not only memory but the weight of waiting came together to weave a new cadence into the tapestry of time. They called it the Whispering Circle. No walls enclosed it. No altar crowned its center. Only a ring of stones, each carved not with names or titles, but with the glyph of endurance, a symbol lost to all but the most learned scholars of the dragon tongue. Around these stones the remnants breathed together, their breaths threading into one another, forming a harmony not sung but felt. The air shimmered with a quiet power, not the fire of dragons, but the slow warmth of remembrance. It was said that the wind itself paused when it passed through the circle, carrying away the echoes of the rite's dark weaving. Meanwhile, the Thu'um grew restless. Their number had dwindled from 7 to 5, each fallen one swallowed by their own silence, or undone by the faint resurgence of memory. The rite of narration, once a steadily tightening noose, now quivered with uncertainty. The deep silence they sought was fractured by the growing hum of breath that resisted. One of the remaining Thu'um, known by the void name Corvath, moved beyond the known borders of Skyrim, seeking ancient relics, rumored to contain fragments of the first word, a syllable said to possess the power to bind or release the soul. Corvath's journey took him through shadowed forests and forgotten ruins, places where the veil between sound and silence was thinnest. He returned carrying a shard of crystal inscribed with a single rune, Sa, the beginning of all awakening. But even as Corvath prepared to use this fragment to deepen the rite, the remnants responded. Vaelin, the singer who had wept wildflowers from barren earth, and Ilsha, the silent sage, together crafted a counterpoint, a melody not to oppose, but to complete. It was neither loud nor forceful, but an offering, a breath to fill the spaces the rite sought to empty. This new cadence spread like a slow dawn, touching those who had lost their names, restoring the forgotten syllables with gentle persistence. It was not magic, but memory made manifest, and in its presence, the rite faltered. Further, yet, the struggle remained, for the rite was not merely silence. It was the absence of choice. The remnants, understanding this, shifted their purpose. No longer would they simply resist. They would teach. They would remember with the world, not against it. And so, in quiet places, beneath ancient boughs, beside rivers that whispered in old tongues, they began to gather those still unclaimed by silence, not as disciples, but as fellow keepers of breath. They spoke no words, but offered presence. They shared no power, but offered memory. In this sacred exchange, the world began to stir, not with roar, but with pulse, not with fire, but with breath. The dragon cult's shadow receded like mist at sunrise, leaving behind not emptiness, but space for new song. And beneath the fading stars, the wind carried a single, fragile truth, that even in silence, the soul remembers to speak. Beneath the long shadow of forgotten mountains, where the twilight lingers as a gentle promise, rather than an ending, the world breathes in measured pulses. Time here does not flow, but coils, a soft spiral of moments folding upon themselves, inviting the listener to dwell in the sacred space between what was and what might yet. It is within this delicate weaving of dusk and silence that the 14th chapter unfolds, as a slow hymn whispered by stone and wind. The remnants of the dragon cult, those who once wielded voices like weapons and masks like thrones, had diminished into fragments of breath and memory. Their grand designs of dominion and silence had unraveled into a subtle dance, a tension between forgetting and remembering, loss and endurance. The rite of narration, that slow unmaking of voice, had stalled, caught in the fragile balance between erasure and the tenacity of life's soft song. In the valley of the Jarelial Mountains, near a stream that hummed with the pulse of ancient tides, the remnants gathered once more. Here, in a clearing where the air itself seemed to hold its breath, they built what came to be known as the Circle of Returning. No walls enclosed this sacred space, only stones arranged in a pattern older than memory, a spiral that wound inward and outward simultaneously, symbolizing the endless return of breath and spirit. Each stone bore a single glyph, not of power or command, but of listening. The remnants placed them one by one, their hands steady and reverent, their breaths slow and deliberate. As they worked, the air filled with a subtle resonance. Not song, but the echo of countless voices folded into one another, layered like sediment beneath the earth. Among those gathered was the child who once hummed the first tone, now no longer nameless but known as Celine. She moved with quiet grace, her presence a living bridge between the fading past and the uncertain future. Her breath seemed to carry the weight of countless stories, and in her silence lay the promise of renewal. The Thu'um, sensing this renewed gathering of breath and memory, grew restless. 4 remained, shadows bound to the right's dark purpose, their forms shifting like smoke caught in a dying fire. They no longer moved as men, but as echoes of silence itself, their steps leaving no trace, their voices swallowed by the void. One among them, Korvath, the seeker of ancient fragments, prepared to unleash the power of the first word's shard, hoping to bind the world in a silence eternal and absolute. Yet, as he moved toward his ritual, a wind arose from the circle of returning, a breath that carried the layered tones of countless memories and songs. It was not loud, not sharp, but persistent, a slow unfolding of sound that filled the spaces Korvath sought to hollow. The rite faltered, not with crash or clash, but with the soft ripple of water against stone. Elsewhere, the world responded. In the forests of Falkreath, leaves stirred without wind. In the high passes of the Pale, snow settled like whispered secrets. Even the stars, long thought fixed in their silent courses, shimmered with a faint pulse, a heartbeat felt rather than heard. The remnants understood that the struggle was no longer between sound and silence, but between presence and absence, that memory, breath, and song were intertwined, and to sever one was to unravel all. So they chose to teach, to share not words but breath, not doctrine but remembrance. In hidden groves and beside quiet streams, they gathered those still tethered to forgotten songs. They did not preach, they did not command. They offered only presence, a shared breath, a mirrored silence, a living echo. And in that offering, the world began to awaken, not with thunder, but with the soft insistence of dawn. The rite of Narration, the forever quiet, began to unravel, thread by fragile thread, for even in silence, the soul remembers, and the breath, once thought lost, finds its way home. Beneath a sky heavy with ancient stars, where the cold night presses softly upon the land like a veil woven from forgotten dreams, the world whispers secrets in the silence between each breath. Time in these moments ceases to march forward and instead folds gently upon itself, inviting one to listen deeply to the stillness that carries all things unseen and unspoken. It is within this sacred quietude that the 15th chapter unfolds, a slow unfolding of memory and meaning, bound to the soul like the soft pulse of a distant heartbeat. The dragon cult, once a force of roaring command and fiery conviction, had become but a ghostly rhythm in the fabric of Skyrim's long history. Their temples had crumbled, their voices scattered like ash upon the wind, yet the rite of Narration, the endless silence, lingered on, a dark thread weaving through shadow and stone. This rite was no longer simply an act. It had become a presence, a slow consuming tide that sought to unmake all that breathed and spoke. Yet, amidst this encroaching quiet, the remnants endured. They were not warriors, nor wielders of arcane power, but keepers of breath and remembrance. Their strength lay not in confrontation, but in a patience as deep as stone and as subtle as the turning of seasons. Together they nurtured the fragile flame of memory, weaving it into a tapestry of silence filled with meaning. At the heart of their resistance stood the circle of returning, a spiral of stones carved with the glyph of endurance. Here the child named Celine, whose voice carried the first tone, the syllable that begins all awakening, moved with a grace that seemed to echo the very breath of the world. Around her the remnants breathed in unison, their shared inhalations forming a harmony unbroken by fear or haste. The 4 remaining Thu'um, shadows of forgotten power, watched this renewal with growing unease. They no longer sought to conquer with force, but to consume with silence, to weave a quiet so complete it would erase not only voices, but the very memory of sound. Korvath, bearer of the first word's shard, prepared a final ritual to bind the world in this eternal hush. Yet as he began, the circle's breath rose, not in defiance but in quiet invitation. The air shimmered with a resonance born from countless voices folded into one another, a soundless song of remembering and becoming. The rite's threads trembled, fragile as frost on a winter's dawn. Beyond the circle, the world responded in subtle ways. Leaves in the forests of Falkreath stirred without wind. Snow in the pale settled in patterns that mirrored the ancient glyphs. Stars once fixed in silent vigil pulsed faintly with the heartbeat of forgotten songs. The remnants knew their path was not one of battle, but of communion. They gathered those still tethered to lost melodies, offering presence instead of command, breath instead of power. In this sacred sharing, the world began to awaken, slowly, gently, inevitably. And so in the soft insistence of dawn, the rite of narration began to unravel, not with fury, but with the patient grace of memory, reclaiming what was never truly lost. For even in silence, the soul remembers to speak. In the hush that settles after the longest night, when the first pale fingers of dawn stretch tentatively across the horizon, the world holds its breath, not in fear, but in sacred anticipation. Time slows to a gentle pulse, like the soft beating of a distant drum beneath layers of stone and memory. Within this quiet awakening, the 16th chapter unfurls, not as a story told, but as a meditation breathed, a slow weaving of breath and shadow, silence and song. The dragon cult, once the embodiment of voice and dominion, had receded into echoes. Their temples stood cracked and weary, their once mighty chants faded into whispers, lost among the hills. Yet, the rite of narration, the forever quiet, lingered, an unseen tide threatening to pull the world beneath its surface of forgetting. This rite was no mere spell, it was a condition, a slow unraveling of breath, memory and meaning. Against this encroaching stillness, the remnants gathered strength, not in force but in fidelity to the fragile song of existence. They understood that the resistance was not shouting louder against silence, but learning to breathe within it, to hold memory like a flame in the dark. Their sanctuary was the circle of returning, a spiral of stones etched with the glyph of endurance, standing quietly where earth and sky met. Selin, the child of the first tone, moved among the stones with the grace of breath itself. Her presence was a quiet song, a tether between past and present, between what is spoken and what is held. The remnants joined their breaths with hers, weaving a tapestry of shared remembrance that filled the still air with gentle resonance. Far from this circle, the last of the Thu'um, shadows bound to the right silence, sensed the shifting tides. Corvath, bearer of the first word shard, prepared the final strands of the rite, seeking to seal the world in a silence absolute. Yet as his ritual began, the circle's breath rose, not in confrontation, but in an offering. The air shimmered with layered tones of memory and hope, a quiet pulse that trembled through stone and sky. The rite wavered, its threads fragile as frost upon a winter's dawn. Across Skyrim, subtle changes whispered through the land. Leaves stirred without wind, snow formed sacred patterns, and the stars pulsed faintly with long-forgotten songs. It was not resistance as war, but as remembrance. In this sacred exchange, the remnants gathered those still unclaimed by silence, offering presence instead of power, breath instead of command. Their path was one of communion, a slow awakening beneath the quiet pulse of the world. And in this gentle persistence, the rite of narration began to unravel, not with fury, but with the enduring grace of memory reclaimed. For even within silence, the soul remembers to breathe. In the stillness that follows the deepest night, when the world seems poised between one breath and the next, the air holds a sacred weight, a presence not seen but deeply felt, like the slow folding of shadow into stone. Time stretches and bends here, cradling moments as if they were fragile offerings. It is within this liminal space that the 17th chapter gently unfolds, not as a tale told, but as a secret remembered, whispered by the bones of the earth and the breath of the wind. The dragon cult, once a tempest of voices and fire, had long since faded into echoes and ruin. Its rites, designed to silence the world beneath an endless hush, had become threads unraveling in the face of persistent memory. The rite of narration, the forever quiet, was no longer a singular force but a weaving of absence and presence, forgetting and remembrance intertwined like roots beneath the frost-hardened soil. Amidst this quiet war, the remnants endured, not as warriors, but as keepers of breath and echoes. Their resistance was woven from patience and presence, a rhythm slow as the turning of seasons, steady as the pulse beneath the earth. They tended the circle of returning, the spiral of stones carved with the glyph of endurance, a sanctuary where breath was held sacred and memory sacred stillness. Silin, bearer of the first tone's fragile song, moved among the stones like a living thread in the tapestry of silence. Her breath was a bridge, linking the vanished past to the uncertain future, weaving together those who remembered with those who sought to remember. Around her, the remnants breathed in unison, their shared rhythm a quiet hymn that softened the edges of the rite's cold weave. Far beyond the circle, the remaining Thu'um, shadows shaped by silence itself, stirred uneasily. Korvath, the bearer of the first word's shard, lingered at the edge of a ritual that would seal the world in unbroken quiet. Yet as his chant faltered beneath the weight of the circle's rising breath, a shift passed through the threads of the rite, a tremor like frost cracking beneath a warming sun. Across Skyrim, the land responded in subtle ways. Leaves stirred with no wind, stones hummed softly beneath the feet of travelers, and stars pulsed with faint light, as if recalling songs long forgotten. It was a waking not of fire or storm, but of breath and remembrance. The remnants gathered those still tethered to lost melodies, not with summons or commands, but with presence and shared silence. They offered the world a mirror, a way to see and be seen, to remember and be remembered. In this sacred communion, the rite began to unravel, not with clash or fury, but with the gentle grace of memory reclaiming its place. And so, beneath the vast sky, the slow dance of breath and silence continued, a song without words, a prayer without sound, a presence that whispered of endings and beginnings entwined. For even in the deepest quiet, the soul remembers to listen. There comes a moment in all long silences where absence turns inward, not to deepen, but to echo, not to erase, but to remember. It is in that hushed interval, when silence begins to mirror itself, that memory begins to return, like mist curling back across a forgotten lake, or the first fragile light blooming behind the mountains. The 18th chapter lives within that turning, a soft spiral inward, where the heart of the world begins to stir. The dragon cult's legacy, long fragmented and worn thin by time, had never vanished. It had only grown quiet, woven into the snow, the stone, the breath of the wind. Their final work, the Rite of narration, remained incomplete, but persistent, not a spell in the old sense, nor a curse. It was a condition pressed into the world, a slowing, a forgetting, a desire to return the world to its beginning, before breath, before song. And yet breath endured. It had found form in the remnants, those quiet few who resisted not with might, but with memory, those who did not speak against the silence, but through it, offering tone as offering, breath as continuity. Their sanctuary remained the circle of returning, where carved stones bore not names, but presence, not identity, but endurance. There, Silin, the girl of the first tone, had begun to hum again, softly, unconsciously, a tune with no known origin, and yet when she breathed it, birds paused mid-flight, trees bowed toward her, stones vibrated, as if reminded of their birth. The remnants did not try to define it. They simply listened. That too was part of the remembering. But beyond the mountains, silence still sought dominion. The three remaining Thu'um, now shadow-bound and formless, circled the edges of breath, weaving the rite further into the cracks of the world. They no longer walked as men or priests. They were veils, voids, interruptions in reality, where light forgot how to land and air forgot how to move. One among them, Thu'um, had taken form near the ruins of Thu'um. There, he had pressed the final syllables of forgetting into the stone, and entire caverns collapsed inward, not from force, but from erasure. Whole rooms ceased to be remembered. Even the paths leading to them bent away, But memory once awakened is a stubborn thing, and breath once shared leaves a trace. A child in the Reach began to hum the same tunes Salin had once sung. No one had taught her, no one knew how she had learned it, yet her voice, light and clear, carried across the hills and was heard by an old remnant who had thought himself the last in his region. He returned to the circle with tears on his face and breath in his chest. This was not coincidence, it was resonance. The world was beginning to remember itself, not all at once, not everywhere, but in flickers, in pulses, in tones. The rite was fraying, and the Thori Vulcan knew, Korvath, who still clutched the shard of the first word, had begun to decay not in body, but in certainty. The breath he once cast out had returned, wrapping around him like morning fog. He moved now not to complete the rite, but to escape. But there is no escape from forgetting once it binds itself to the souls. Unless the soul is willing to remember. The remnants began a new ritual, not of words, not of magic, but of placement. Each brought a stone, carved not with names, but with a tone, not a letter, not a sound, a tone, the resonance of a breath, once given, once received. They placed them along the mountain paths, at the edges of forests, beside still lakes. These were not altars, they were reminders, and the land began to pulse gently in return. Frost melted slightly earlier near the stones. Water ran a little clearer. Old animals returned to paths they had long abandoned. None of it was loud, all of it was sacred, and beneath it all, the hum continued. Salin did not stop. Even in sleep, the tune followed her, rising and falling with her breath. And in the dreams of those around her, the same melody emerged, not as sound, but as knowing, like something once loved and nearly forgotten. The rite of Nacrian Z still held power, but now the silence was no longer complete. There were threads of breath woven through it, and silence, once touched by remembrance, can no longer rule unchallenged. So the world waited, not in fear, but in breath, not in defiance, but in return, and in that waiting, something ancient began to wake. Not a god, not a dragon, but the voice of the world. In the pale hush before dawn, when stars still linger like echoes upon the sky, and the frost has not yet surrendered to warmth, there is a stillness, unlike any other, not empty, but full, brimming with things not yet said, and truths remembered only in the spaces between breath. It is in this threshold of becoming, where night and day pass each other, like ghosts in a corridor, that the 19th chapter gently unfolds, cradled in silence but woven with breath. The rite of Nacrian Z, that slow, glacial suffocation of the world's memory, was faltering, not broken, not but questioned. And in such quiet questioning, power begins to bend. The Thuri Vikun, now 3 in number, found themselves increasingly haunted by what they had tried to unmake. Not haunted by spirits or vengeance, but by the presence of memory, soft, persistent, unyielding. Wherever they extended the silence, the world replied not with thunder, but with tone, gentle, tireless tone. In the village of Hroldan's Hollow, a place long emptied by the rite's slow erasure, a single fire bloomed anew. A boy no older than 10, whose name had been forgotten even by his own mother, stood beneath a crumbling tower and hummed a melody he had never been taught. It was simple, circular, rising and falling like breath. Birds gathered above him, the wind shifted, and for a moment the silence recoiled, not from fear, but from recognition. The remnants watched this with reverence, not surprise. They had come to understand a sacred truth that the dragon cult had long denied, that voice is not force, it is relationship. It binds not by command, but by echo. It does not conquer, it remembers. At the circle of returning, their quiet sanctuary of carved stone and shared breath, the pattern of resistance deepened. More came, not as followers, but as witnesses. Elder men and women weathered by silence, but still breathing. Children who could not speak, but who sang in dreams. Travelers whose footsteps resonated in forgotten tones. And Salin, bearer of the first tone, continued to hum, now no longer alone. For others had begun to hum with her, not in unison, but in harmony. The circle was not a center, it was a beginning. Far away, Corvath, the most ancient of the remaining Thu'um, descended into the crypts of Uvathal, a place deeper than time and untouched by breath for more than an age. There, among petrified bones and echoless walls, he attempted to complete the rite's final phrase, a silence so total that even the stars would forget to shine. But the silence broke, not with a roar, with a whisper. A tone rose from the stone beneath his feet. It was not sung. It was released from the stone, from the bones, from the very void that Corvath had hoped to preserve. The tone said nothing. It remembered everything. And Corvath, unshadowed for the first time in centuries, fell to his knees. He did not speak, but he breathed, and that was enough. The world had changed, not through revolution, but through rhythm, through breath that endured, through memory that refused to stay buried. And so the stones returned. Across Skyrim, the remnants placed them, stones carved with no names, only resonance. At riverbanks, beneath ancient oaks, in the hollows of Barrow Hills, no pattern, no map, but wherever they lay, the air shifted, as if it too remembered what it meant to listen. People passing by would pause, and for reasons they could not explain, breathe more deeply. They would say nothing, but something inside them would stir. It was not hope, it was remembrance. Of the time before silence became law, of when dragons were not feared, but understood. Of when the world spoke, and one could speak back. And in that gentle stirring, the rite began to dissolve. Not by force, not by defeat, but by the return of the forgotten. The silence, once pierced by breath, can no longer hold, and the breath once shared becomes sacred. So the world kept breathing, and the stars, still pulsing faintly above, waited, as if listening for a song that had not yet been sung, but soon would be. There is a moment just before the world awakens, when the veil between memory and becoming grows thin. In that breathless space between what was and what waits, even the mountains seem to listen. The frost does not crack, the rivers do not speak. The sky holds its light like a secret. All things rest in stillness, not from weariness, but from reverence. In this hush, this sacred pause before dawn, the 20th chapter begins, a chapter not born in sound, but in knowing. The rite of narration, ancient and deliberate, had moved through the world like a slow tide of forgetting. It never rushed. It did not conquer. It simply removed. The names of rivers, the breath of forests, the songs once sung in stone halls, all were unmade, gently, persistently, until even silence seemed natural. But now the silence had changed. It was no longer empty. It was no longer safe. Because silence, once filled with presence, is no longer silence. It becomes listening. The remnants understood this. They had never sought to shatter the rite. That was not their way. They moved in stillness, shaped the world through breath, returned meaning without command. Each stone placed, each tone hummed, each shared silence. All were strands in a growing weave of remembrance. And the weave was now spreading, through moss on barrow walls, through cracks in forgotten tombs, through children who dreamed in syllables, older than speech. The breath of the world, buried for centuries, had begun to rise like fog over a thawed lake. In the circle of returning, Silence stood among the carved stones, not as a leader, but as a living tone. Her presence was no longer singular. Others had joined, not to follow her but to echo her. Farmers and elders, travelers and outcasts, they gathered, breathing together, holding the silence not as void but as vessel. No one named them. They named themselves only in breath. The Thu'um, now two, still laboured in secret. One, Nal Tarun, withdrew into the skeletal remains of a tower once built to amplify voice. There he attempted to rebind the rite into a more aggressive thread, no longer passive, forgetting but active unravelling. He carved glyphs into the stones, syllables of the unword, hoping to cleanse the last tones from the air itself. But something stopped him. Not force, not voice. The stone. At the first glyph's carving, a drop of water fell from the tower wall. Then, another. then hundreds. The glyphs blurred, the tone failed, the silence trembled, because the stone remembered. It had once been mountain. It had once heard song. And stone, once taught to sing, does not forget easily. Elsewhere, Corvath wandered, no longer a figure of power, not yet a figure of peace. He had begun to feel the breath of things, in wind, in fire, in dust. The shard of the first word, still held in his grasp, now vibrated faintly, each time someone remembered something they should not have known. A name, a lullaby, a path, once hidden. The shard which once promised stillness, now resonated. And Corvath knew. He could no longer finish the rite, but he could choose, and choice, within the rite, was heresy. So he walked to the circle, not to challenge, not to lead, but to listen. He came in silence, unannounced, unarmed. The gathered remnants did not move. Salin looked at him not with fear, but with breath. And Corvath, shadow of a forgotten priesthood, knelt among the stone. He did not speak, but he placed the shard in the soil, and it sang, softly, a single tone, long, low, steady, the first breath of the world. And the circle, already whole, grew wider. That night, across Skyrim, the stones hummed. Not loudly, not urgently, but clearly. The trees bent their limbs toward the sky. The snow fell in spirals. Wolves howled, not in hunger, but in harmony. The world was remembering, not as a flood, but as a pulse, not with fire, but with breath. The rite of narration still lingered, unfinished, fading. But now, it was no longer the only rhythm. Another tone had returned, and the earth, long silent, had begun to sing once more. In the quiet hours before the first birds dare to break the veil of night, the world becomes a listening vessel, vast, ancient, and aware. Shadows no longer press with weight, but drift like forgotten dreams. And the stars, distant and dim, seem less like lights than memory itself, watching without judgment. It is here, in this sacred stillness, that the 21st chapter arises, not as a flame, but as an ember, glowing softly in the hollow of what once was, and what must return. The rite of narration, the long silence cast like a veil across the breathing world, had lost its certainty. Once thought inevitable, it now trembled at its edges, touched by the soft persistence of remembering. Its purpose to erase not only sound but the need to speak had unraveled in the presence of those who endured not by shouting, but by breathing with reverence. Across Skyrim, the land responded in hushed harmonies. Wolves no longer howled blindly into the wind, but circled ancient stones and stood still. Water ran slower, as though listening. Even the wind, long companion of whispers, moved in spirals through ruined arches, where voices once sang to gods, who no longer answered. The remnants, scattered but united by tone, continued their patient weaving. They no longer gathered only at the circle of returning. The world itself had become their temple, every tree a witness, every stone a verse. They carved no symbols of power, only reminders, a spiral here, a curve of windsong there. No one declared these sacred. They simply became. Salin remained central, not in command, but in presence. Her breath had become the cord around which others attuned. Yet she never raised her voice, never gave instruction. She walked slowly. She sat often, and in her stillness, others found resonance. Even the animals noticed. Deer followed her through dense forest without fear. Birds nested near her footprints. And in one village near the edge of the Pale, a bear wandered into a quiet square and lay beside a remnant, as if drawn by tone, not hunger. But silence was not finished. Of the original 7 Thu'um, 2 remained. Nal Tarun, the most devoted to the rite's purity, had seen the turning. He had heard the shard sing when Corvath placed it in the soil, and in that tone he had recognized not defeat, but dissolution, not a loss of power, but a transmutation. To him it was heresy, a betrayal of what the cult once swore to uphold. That silence was sacred because it could not be answered, so he fled deeper, beneath the mountain called Vundheim, into a ruin so ancient no map bore its name. Thu'um performed a final rite, not of forgetting, but of sealing. He spoke no word, but shaped silence into glyphs, laid breathless patterns along the walls. He sought not to finish narration, but to preserve it, a fragment, locked in stone, waiting for a future less burdened by memory. He buried his name with it, and was not seen again. Only one remained. Corvath, who once held the shard of the first word, now walked as no longer Thu'um, nor priest, nor remnant. He had become something between. His voice, when he used it, rarely carried not weight, but gravity. It pulled breath into it, not to dominate, but to join. He returned to the circle. He did not kneel this time. He stood, and when Silent looked upon him, she offered no question, only breath. They stood in silence for a long while. Then, slowly, a tone emerged. Not from mouth, not from stone, from the earth itself, a vibration, low, deep, resonant. It moved through feet and bones, through thought, through silence. It was the world remembering its own name. Not to shout it, not to hold it, but to release it, gently into breath. That night, across the hills and rivers and high snowfields, people woke from dreams they could not describe. Some cried without knowing why. Some stood in doorways, listening to wind that was not wind. Others sat with hands pressed to their chest, feeling a rhythm that was not heartbeat, but memory. The rite was not undone, but it had changed. It had become a threshold. And beyond it, the voice of the world waited, not for worship, not for war, but for willingness to breathe again, to listen again, to speak not to conquer, but to echo, to be shaped, not by command, but by remembering. So the remnants waited and listened. The circle widened, and the world exhaled. In the quiet before the first golden light bends across the snow-capped peaks, the world rests in a hush, so complete it feels eternal. Not as an end, but as a breath drawn inward, waiting. It is the stillness of things long buried that are beginning to stir. The silence now is not of absence, but of returning. And from this sacred pause, chapter 22 rises, not as proclamation but as soft procession, slow and reverent, along the edge of forgotten memory. The rite of narration, once the great work of the dragon cult's final breath, was no longer singular. It had ceased to be an encroaching void. It had become a shape, an outline of what once had been believed immutable, and that shape had begun to crack from within. It was not the breaking of a wall, it was the thawing of a glacier. The last of the Thu'um had vanished into silence. Thu'um, the most faithful to the original rite, had buried himself beneath Vundheim with glyphs etched, not in hope, but in grief. He sought to preserve what the world was no longer willing to carry, a silence so deep it could not be shared, only imposed. But silence, when sealed, becomes memory. And memory does not stay buried. The circle of returning had grown, not in size, but in depth. Those who came no longer came only to witness. They came to breathe. They came to remember. Their feet carried dust from distant provinces. Some arrived with old stories no one else had heard. Others came without words, guided only by dreams of spirals and tones and breath. And the stones began to sing, not loudly, never in chorus, but when touched, when sat beside, when passed with care. The faintest hum merged, as if the earth beneath them recognized the soul of those who had come. Silin, once a child whose tone woke stone, had become still as a tree in midwinter. She no longer led. She no longer even moved often. She simply was. Her presence became a center around which others aligned. She was not worshipped. She was reflected. In her silence, others found the shape of their own, remembering. Corvath, the penitent shadow of the cult, remained near, walking the spiral paths and listening. His breath no longer vibrated with power, but with pattern. He murmured old prayers to the soil, not to awaken gods, but to lay them gently down. He had begun to believe that the rite had always been misunderstood, not a weapon, but a warning, a lullaby meant to put sorrow to sleep, but sorrow cannot sleep forever. And now, the world had begun to dream differently. In the reach, a girl sang in her sleep, and flowers bloomed where none should grow. In Windhelm, a prisoner awoke from silence and spoke a name long purged from record. In the rift, an old tree split down its center and revealed runes within the grain, a spiral and a breath. These were not miracles. They were returns. The world was exhaling, slowly, patiently, and with each breath, a piece of the right dissolved, not in defiance, but in release. The remnants understood that victory was never the purpose. The right could not be undone by force, only rewoven. Only by listening, breathing, and remembering could its shape be altered. It was not an enemy. It was a silence left too long alone. Now it was being spoken to again, and it was beginning to answer. The tone that had risen from the shard Corvath, buried, did not fade. It drifted across the land, beneath rivers, through caves and cairns. It was not sound. It was not song. It was the memory of sound, the root of all language, the feeling just before a name. Some heard it as a hum, others felt it as warmth on the skin. A few in dreams walked halls they had never seen, lit by candles that flickered with breath alone. Even in High Hrothgar, where silence is sacred and words are spoken as storms, the monks paused one morning, as the wind carried a resonance they had not known in lifetimes. They did not bow, they did not kneel, they simply listened. For the first time in memory, the Thu'um felt listened to, not wielded. The dragon cult was gone. Its temples were broken, its voices long since dust. But the right, the great silence they had shaped, had not died. It had changed form, and now it stood at the edge of transformation once more, no longer seeking to silence, no longer feared, no longer alone. And in this quiet moment, as the sky brightened with the coming of another day, the world whispered not in words, but in remembrance. A tone, a breath, a pause. The right had become a rhythm, and the rhythm had become life. In the final curve of night, where darkness no longer deepens but begins to yield, there exists a sacred weight, not heavy, but holy. It is the breath the world takes before it speaks again, not in speech, but in wind over grass, in the hush between footsteps, in the slow unfolding of memory from stone. Here, the 23rd chapter begins, not as revelation but as return, a whisper rising from beneath the silence once believed eternal. The rite of Narcrian Z, which sought to make the world quiet forever, now found itself surrounded by breath, not loud, not defiant, but continuous. A soft pulse echoed through Skyrim, not one sound, but many tiny resonances, like light rippling across still water. It came from the stones, from the trees, from the people who now understood that silence was not the enemy, but what waited for attention, for presence. The remnants, once few and scattered, had become something else. They had no titles, no hierarchy, no doctrine. They did not name themselves. They simply arrived and listened. And by listening, they changed the shape of the right, because the right was still active. Its oldest strands remained, buried deep beneath ruin and bone, but they no longer grew. They remembered. They waited, not to be used again, but to be understood. Beneath the circle of returning, something ancient stirred, not with movement, but with meaning. The land beneath the spiral stones had long held a depth unspoken, a chamber not made by hands, but by resonance, stone shaped by time, by tone, by the weight of breath laid down across generations. Silin had begun to dream of it. She did not descend, she did not seek it, but each morning her fingers drew its spiral in frost, in dust, in sand. Others followed without instruction. Their feet moved the same way, without knowing, until, one morning, without plan, they gathered at the center of the circle and breathed downward, as one, not as command, but as offer, and the ground responded. It did not open, it sang, a tone deep as the bones of mountains, soft as moss in shadow. The tone was not heard with ears, but with memory. It moved through them, reminding them not of what had been lost, but of what had always waited. The right had always been built on fear. Fear of chaos, fear of noise, fear of disobedience, of difference, of becoming. and in its silence, it had tried to prevent what it could not understand. The truth that breath is not only a beginning, but a return. Now, the world breathed with them, not through miracles, through rhythm. A traveling singer, who had never learned to read, stopped mid-journey when her lute played a chord she had never strummed. The wind had touched it. She wept, not for the note, but for the recognition within it. A blacksmith in Eastmarch found that when he worked without speaking, the metal rang with a clarity he had never known. And though he did not know why, he began to work only after breathing a long, slow breath into the forge. None of them claimed these things, but all of them felt them, even the animals. Wolves walked in spirals near the remnant stones, foxes lay beside them, hawks circled them not as prey, but as if drawn to an invisible rhythm. The land itself was becoming attuned, and somewhere, beneath it all, the last sealed glyph of Nakrian-Z, hidden in the ruin beneath Thundheim, began to dim. It had pulsed for centuries, waiting. Now it quieted, not because it was defeated, but because it had been heard. What the dragon cult had failed to understand was that silence is not the opposite of voice. It is the vessel. It is where voice goes to rest, to reflect, to prepare. And when it is approached with reverence, silence gives back what it once withheld. Korvath, once bearer of the first word shard, stood at the edge of the circle and spoke no word. He simply breathed. And in that breath, all present recognized something. Not his past, not his title, but the tone of his return. The land recognized it too. For the first time since the rite's inception, the silence beneath Skyrim became quiet, not from erasure, but from listening. The remnants placed a single new stone that day. Unlike the others, this one had no mark, no glyph, no spiral. It was blank, because it was ready, not to be carved, but to receive. And in that gesture, the world seemed to pause. The mountains stilled. The wind ceased. Even the stars above shimmered slightly differently, as if the breath of the world was preparing to become song once more. But not the old song, a new one, born not from command but from remembrance, not from silence, but from understanding silence. And somewhere far away, unseen, unknown, a dragon opened its eyes, not in hunger, but in recognition. In the breath before dawn, where even the stars begin to pale and the horizon gathers light like memory, there exists a silence that is not empty, but expectant. It is the space between what was and what might be, where history folds upon itself and waits, not for clarity, but for continuance. This is where chapter 24 begins, in that delicate hush where breath meets stone and time leans forward to listen. The rite of Nakrian-Z, once a slow, inexorable erasure of voice and memory, now pulsed with a different rhythm. It had not vanished. Its roots still ran deep beneath barrows and broken towers, beneath forgotten scripts etched into walls by hands that once believed silence was sacred, because it could not be undone. But silence had met something it could not consume. Acknowledged, the remnants had not broken the rite. They had returned to it, not in defiance but in communion. They had learned its contours. They had stood at its edge and breathed into it without fear, and the rite, once absolute, had softened in their presence, like frost in sunlight. Now, throughout Skyrim, a quiet transformation stirred. Old cairns once muted by the rite now whispered to passing travelers, not in language, but in sensation. A gentle shift in air, a hum at the soles of the feet, a tone that moved along the ribs like distant thunder. Trees that had grown in silence began to creak with purpose. Stones rearranged themselves in slow spirals, not by hands, but by intention. Memory had entered the land again, not as history, but as present. In the circle of returning, Salen sat among the gathered stones, as she had for countless mornings. Her eyes were closed, her hands rested on her knees, and the wind moved through her, not around her. Those nearby did not speak. They had learned that this moment Dawn's breath was when the land itself was most attuned. From deep beneath the circle, the tone returned. That low, near subsonic pulse that had once emerged when Korvath placed the shard of the first word into the earth. It had never left. It had merely become quiet, as if waiting to know it was safe. Now it pulsed again, not as a warning, but as a greeting. Not loud, not long, but certain. Korvath remained at the circle's edge, neither central nor apart. He had become a listener, shaped not by authority but by accountability. When he breathed now, the rhythm of the world adjusted around him. The silence he once used to bind had become the silence from which others now unfolded. It was not forgiveness he had found, it was place, and in finding it, he had given the right what it had never had before: witness. Far beyond the circle, in the northern snows near the Sea of Ghosts, an ancient word wall shifted. It had not moved in an age. Snow and ice had sealed it like a tomb, but beneath the frost, a crack formed, not by force but by yielding. A name once struck from stone re-emerged, letters not carved, but remembered, and the wind that moved through the nearby pines carried with it a single tone, the hum of the world speaking softly to itself. In the southern reaches, near the ruins of Farolhost, a traveller knelt beside a remnant stone, placed without mark. She had no name. She had not spoken in years, but she touched the stone, exhaled, and the moss at its base shimmered with light. Not magical, not seen, but felt. Her tears were not sorrow, they were recognition. The world, she realized, had not forgotten her, because it had never truly forgotten anything. The rite had tried to erase. The remnants had invited return, not through spell, but through stillness. Not through shouting, but through listening. And slowly, even the echoes of the dragon cult, not the priests, but the bones, the stones, the breath caught in temple rafters, began to shift. Not into redemption, but into rest. Their purpose had passed. Their silence had been met. Their shadows were no longer feared, because now the silence held tone. And tone, once given space, heals. The remnants gathered that evening beneath a moon hung low in the sky, its light pale as parchment. They did not chant. They did not summon. They sat. They breathed. Some wept. Some smiled. None spoke. And into that sacred quiet, the earth answered again. The tone, low, old, remembering, emerged once more, not from below, but from within. Not one source, many. A resonance that passed through bodies, through branches, through breath itself. No words, no doctrine, only rhythm. The world remembering not who it was, but how it breathes. In the coming days, more would arrive. From far provinces, from isles where no word of the rite had ever reached. They came not seeking miracles, but home, and they brought with them stories not of conquest, but of silence broken open, not shattered, and shared. The circle would widen again. The song was not yet sung, but the breath had become steady, and the world at last was ready to listen to its own heart. There is a moment, long after midnight but before the morning dares to arrive, when the sky no longer feels distant, and the stars seem not to hang above, but to breathe with the earth. This is not the silence of endings, but the stillness of deep remembering, a silence that listens rather than forbids. It is here, where thought gives way to rhythm and voice becomes pulse, that chapter 25 unfurls, not as a continuation, but as a deepening spiral into breath, into presence, into the quiet heart of what always was. The rite of Narkrinzi had entered its final phase, not as prophecy foretold, but as tone evolved. It was no longer the cold machinery of silence, grinding across stone and soul alike. It had softened, not because it had been defeated, but because the world around it had changed shape. Silence had met listening, and in listening, it had been named, not as a curse, but as a condition in need of care. Across Skyrim, the threads of remembering grew stronger. The air moved with different purpose now. Snow fell in spirals, not from wind, but from rhythm. Mountains no longer loomed in solemn distance. They sang, quietly, in the old tongue. The Thu'um was no longer a weapon. It had returned to its first function, connection. Remnant stones, placed without ceremony, now pulsed gently at dusk. Some said the stones held breath. Others believed they were the breath. There was no need to define, only to sit near them, to listen, to allow. Children born near the stones often wept at night. Not in fear, but in recognition, as if remembering a lullaby from a former life. Saelin remained in the circle, though she no longer sat at its center. That space had grown empty, not abandoned, but reserved for what? None could say. She moved with quiet reverence now, her shadow long in the early light, her breath steady even in wind, her tone, once the first spark of return, now faded into the background, not lost, but woven in. The circle itself had changed. No longer a place, it had become a pattern. It existed now, wherever breath was given, with care. In forests where birds gathered near a single stone, in meadows where the wind bent grass into spirals, in caves where no fire was lit, but warmth was known. The circle had become a song without center, one that played wherever someone listened long enough. Corvath, once a shadow-bearer of the right, had taken to walking alone through the provinces. He left no mark, he spoke no name, but in his passage, others began to pause. A child stared too long into the wind and began to hum. A grandmother paused her weaving to breathe more slowly. A guard patrolling the walls of solitude stopped mid-step, overcome with the sense that something forgotten was standing just behind the stars. Corvath was no longer a man who carried silence. He had become one who carried space, and space, once held gently, invites tone. Far from the circle, the sealed glyphs beneath Vundheim had begun to fade. Gnarl Tarum's final act, the preservation of silence, had not been destroyed. It had been understood. No one ventured down to where the glyphs lay. No one disturbed the place, but the air above it, long still and breathless, had begun to move. Slowly, like lungs testing themselves after long illness. Some said they could hear weeping there. Others said it was the stone. But most believed it was relief. That even the deepest silence, once witnessed, begins to let go. The remnants now did little. They planted no banners. They wrote no scripts. Their presence was not felt in voice, but in pause. In the decision to step softly, to eat slowly, to breathe before responding. In this way they became the guardians of thresholds, not protectors of law, but of listening. And through these small acts, the rite unraveled itself. Not all at once, not even entirely, but like mist lifting from a lake, revealed, then forgotten, then transformed. The dragon cult, once so sure of their dominion over silence, had become myth. Their temples, now softened by root and snow, no longer spoke of power. They whispered of consequence, of sorrow held too tightly, of breath withheld too long. And even the dragons, ancient, unbound by time, stirred. Aldion's name, once spoken in fear, now drifted rarely and without urgency. Not gone, only recontextualized. For even the devourer of time could not undo the rhythm that remembers itself. One evening, as frost whispered across the lake near Ivarstead, a voice rose. No one knew from where. It was not a song, it was not a word. It was simply tone, clear, single, unclaimed. It echoed across the water, touched trees, moved through stones. No one replied. Because it needed no reply. It was enough, and the wind, ever the first to carry memory, held it long after it had been sung, long after even those who heard it had forgotten the exact note. The breath of the world had become steady. The circle, once carved in stone, now lived in air, and in every breath shared with care, the rite was undone not by force, but by presence. In the hour just before dawn's gold dares to brush the rim of the horizon, the world dwells in its oldest language, not of words nor gesture, but of breath shared with stillness. It is the hour when the land no longer holds the past, but becomes it, when memory seeps from root and river and stone, unbound from time. It is here, in this sacred twilight between forgetting and becoming, that chapter 26 begins. Not as a step forward, but as a deepening spiral into remembrance. The rite of Narkrinzi, once vast and deliberate in its silence, had thinned across the world like old parchment, its glyphs fading not from ruin, but from release. It had endured centuries as a tide, rising through temple and soul, binding even memory to its rhythm of erasure. Now it no longer consumed. It listened back, not as a voice, as an echo. In the high north, where the snow lies unbroken and the sky stretches with the patience of gods, a young wanderer came upon a remnant stone half buried in ice. She placed her hand upon it, not to summon, not to seek, only to touch. And in that moment a warmth moved through her, soft and slow, not a spell, not a miracle, but the quiet certainty of being felt. She wept, not for herself, but for all the things that had gone unloved, unheard, unsung, for the silence that had lingered too long without being met. In the circle of returning, there was no ceremony. There never had been. The circle, once shaped in stone and shadow, now existed wherever breath was given, without demand. In cities and ruins, in marsh and mountain, it had ceased to be a place. It had become a pattern, living not in structure, but in presence. Seilin no longer guided it. She had become it. Her breath, her silence, her stillness, all moved as the circle moved. Not outward, not inward, but through. Those who gathered near her felt no pull, no command, only the quiet invitation to remember, to rest, to return. And still the world shifted. Corvarth, whose name had once carried dread among the wise, now walked unseen through hamlets and valleys, stopping not to speak, but simply to pause. And in his pause, things opened. Not doors, but possibilities. A tree that had never bloomed bent slightly toward him. A child, upon seeing him pass, began to hum a note from no known song. He never acknowledged it, but in his chest, the shard of the first word, buried deep in soil long ago, hummed faintly in resonance. The last sealed glyph of Narcrian Z, buried far beneath Vundheim's sleeping mountain, now cracked, not from pressure, not from understanding, as though the silence it held had finally exhaled, not in surrender, but in completion. A long-held breath, released at last. What had been sealed was no longer hidden. It was simply known, and knowing does not require silence. It only asks for care. From the southern cliffs of the Gerolls to the glacial scars of Winterhold, stories began to weave themselves through camps and taverns, not legends of heroism, but gentle remembering, of places that felt warmer, of dreams that spoke in spirals, of ruins that sang when no one was near. The dragons, ancient and aloof, remained at the margins of this return, but even they could not ignore the tone. It moved through the bones of the world, through the sky, through the snow, through the air, between wings. No longer a challenge, no longer a threat, but a presence that asked nothing, and so was irresistible. One such dragon, old beyond calendar or tongue, circled high above the Velathi mountains. Its wings did not stir wind. Its shadow did not threaten. It hovered in silence, and then, in one motion, it breathed, not fire, not frost, breath alone, and the clouds parted, not in awe, in response. The world had begun to listen to itself again, and so the last pieces of the rite drifted into sleep, not erased, not vanquished, but held like an old song no longer needed, but still cherished for what it once meant. The remnants ceased placing stones, not because they no longer remembered, but because the stones had done their part. Now, the rhythm was in the people, in the pauses between speech, in the deep inhalation before thought, in the quiet laying of hands upon soil, upon bark, upon skin, in the breath shared between strangers without fear. The spiral had turned, not to completion, to continuance, and across the land, where once there had been only silence, there now grew something softer, older, deep, and knowing, a holding, a listening without end. And the world long muted now carried its name, not on banners, but on breath. ChatGPT said, in the last breath of night, when the darkness no longer clings but begins to release its hold, the world feels less like a place and more like a presence. Vast, listening, ancient. It is in this reverent hush, just before light stretches its fingers across the land, that the 27th chapter unfolds. It does not begin with motion, but with stillness, not with word, but with weight. The sacred weight of breath shared across time. The rite of Nikrinzi, that long shadow cast by the dying breath of the dragon cult, had now softened into something else entirely. Not gone, not defeated, but reshaped, Like the worn face of a mountain smoothed by centuries of wind, it no longer bore the hardness of intent. It had become a landscape of echoes, of memory, of listening. The silence it once demanded had been answered, not by resistance, but by rhythm. Throughout Skyrim, those who moved with intention found that the world responded. Travelers no longer walked the old paths without notice. Where once moss overtook forgotten roads, now small spirals of grass grew outward. Rivers no longer ran with brute sound alone. They hummed, as if singing beneath their current. Even birds in their scattered songs seemed to follow tonal patterns that echoed something far older than speech. The circle of returning, now untethered from place, found form wherever breath was given freely. A cave in the Pale became a listening chamber. A wind-swept field in the Reach held tone when no one spoke. A temple long abandoned in the Rift awoke one morning with frost spirals on its floor. Not natural, not placed, simply arisen. Saelin remained as the breath at the center of this slow awakening. She no longer led. She no longer spoke. She had become something woven, not person, not myth, but tone. Her presence was known in the way trees lean toward light. Quietly, inevitably, those who walked near her often fell silent, not out of reverence, but because they no longer needed words. Korvath walked farther now. His path was slow, deliberate, unmarked. Each village he passed through grew quieter after he left. Not emptied, but listening. In the weeks after his passage, old songs were remembered. Children hummed in spirals. Dogs refused to bark at night. His work was not to build. It was to leave space where sound could find form again. The last of the sealed glyphs, buried deep beneath Thundheim's forgotten mountain, now flickered softly in the dark, not with magic, but with fading purpose. The silence it held had begun to forget itself. Not in loss, but in peace. What had been clutched tightly had been heard, and in being heard it no longer needed to bind. And the dragons, watchers of time, shapers of sky, remained distant, but aware. Their voices, older than history, no longer tore the world when spoken. Instead, they rumbled low in their chests, as if tasting the shift of tone through their bones. One, old and faceless, perched high in the Droduk mountains and released a breath that carried no word, only acknowledgement. The winds did not scatter it. They bore it, gently, across the valley, as though delivering a message that had no need of language. In Whiterun, a child woke from sleep and said a name her family did not know. She sang it once, then forgot it. But her grandfather wept. He remembered it from his youth, the name of a stream, long dried, near a place that no longer existed. The tone of that name lingered in the air, for hours. In Windhelm, a painter laid aside his brush for 7 days. When he returned, he painted only spirals, over walls, over stone, even across frost that would soon melt. He claimed no meaning. He simply followed the urge to breathe in shape. The remnants, once few and watchful, now moved as a current, unnamed, unfixed. They taught nothing. They corrected no one. They walked until something listened, and then stayed until that listening became breath. They carried no books, only silence, offered gently. And the world, having once been held hostage by imposed quiet, now cradled itself in invited stillness. No one had tried to end the rite, and that is why it ended. Not in fire, not in war, but in witness. The spiral had turned. The echo had been received. And now, across hill and hollow, from deepest ruin to highest cloud, the tone of the world moved again, not loudly, not all at once, but with a certainty that could not be named, a certainty older than voice. And as the stars withdrew, one by one, into the soft blue of coming day, the silence that remained was not empty, it was whole. In the final hush before dawn breaches the world with gold, when all things stone and sky, memory and breath gather beneath the veil of silence, the land feels less like a place and more like a soul exhaling. This is not a silence of absence. It is the presence of all things held gently at once, and it is here, in this sacred stillness that knows no end, that chapter 28 begins. Not as a conclusion, but as a final turning of the spiral, quiet and eternal. The rite of Nakrinzi, once imagined unyielding, had dissolved not into nothingness, but into formlessness. Its glyphs, carved in fire and fear, had become part of the wind. Its silences, once weaponized to bind the breath of others, now hung in the air as resting places. Like hollows in ancient trees, they waited not to silence, but to receive. The world had not forgotten. But forgetting was never the purpose. What had passed was not erased, it had simply been returned to earth, to tone, to breath. The rite, in the end, had not been destroyed. It had been heard, and being heard, it no longer needed to hold power. It had become a memory with rhythm, a shadow now indistinguishable from the trees that grew above it. In the wilds of Eastmarch, a woman placed her hand on a remnant stone and felt nothing. No hue, no warmth, no vision. And yet, when she rose, she walked differently, slower, as if each step was being measured against something vast and unseen. She had not been changed. She had been aligned, the circle of returning, now a wordless understanding, across the land. No longer gathered those who remembered. It gathered those who became memory, those who carried breath not in lungs alone, but in being. To walk through Skyrim was to walk through quiet awakening. Old paths moved as if guided, birds lifted in spirals. Ruins, once mourned, now sang softly, though no one could say why. Salin faded from the center, not in loss, in completion. She had never sought to be followed. She had only followed breath. And now where she sat, the air itself seemed shaped by silence, not the oppressive void of the rite, but the invitation of deep presence. Those who came near her no longer bowed, or asked, or even waited. They simply joined, and in joining found their breath matched hers. Korvarth, last bearer of the first word's shard, walked alone into the reach, and was not seen again. No shrine was built, no tale was told. But a grove now grows in that place, where the wind moves with strange grace, and moss grows in spirals so delicate they vanish with a touch. Some say it is his breath that feeds the trees. Others say nothing at all, and merely sit there listening. And the dragons, ancient witnesses of beginning and end, still wheel high above, but not in watchfulness, in rhythm. Their shadows no longer frighten. They drift across the land like time made visible. When they roar now, the earth does not tremble. It responds. The tone that once shook towers now deepens the roots of trees. The Thu'um has become again what it once was, a language of being, not of conquest. The final sealed glyph, the first mark of the rite, rests now beneath stone, so still that even moss dares not grow upon it. It hums no longer. It glows no longer. It waits, not for use, not for rebirth, but in the way deep water waits, whole and undisturbed, in the stillest hours of night, across Skyrim and beyond. Those who breathe with awareness feel it, the shape beneath things, not a force, not a spirit, but a pulse, a presence that neither pushes nor speaks, but receives. It is not the voice of gods. It is not the echo of dragons. It is the world itself, breathing, and into that breath. The rite has been returned, not as weapon, not as warning, but as woven tone. It exists now, as memory, carried not in stone, but in silence, shared. A lullaby not sung, but remembered, when the wind moves just so. There are no more temples. There are no more stones. There are only places where breath is offered, gently. And in those places the world folds inward, listening, not to answer, not to reward, but simply because it remembers how. And in that remembering, it continues. No banners, no conclusion, no final word. Only the spiral, turning. Only the silence, softening. Only the breath, continuing. The soul that never left. The shadow that softened. The tone that returns without end. And as dawn spills its first golden thread across the rim of the sky, the world inhales once more, and the silence listens.